The saying goes, a best friend is one soul abiding in two bodies. It's an unbreakable bond that stands the test of time.
They really believed they were family. They were sisters, not biological sisters, but they referred to themselves as sisters and best friends.
They spent a lot of time together, you know. All the things the teenage girls did, they did together, and they were inseparable.
And when a woman finds love in a partner, it's an even deeper soul tie that knows no bounds.
Nice looking guy, tall, brown skinned, muscular, very well dressed, smelled so good.
I thought that he was a real respectful young man. He had a strong faith in God.
Sometimes what appears to be true love is nothing but pure evil.
He has started controlling and dominating her life.
She had cuts along her face. The road rash on her was terrible. Her clothes were tattered and torn.
But relentless devotion to a lover can sever the tight bonds of friendship.
Women are put into positions to where they end up doing something that they don't necessarily want to do because of the actions of their partners.
She just kept saying, they're going to kill me, they're going to kill me.
October 17th, 2015, Dearborn, Michigan.
Dearborn is approximately 26 square miles, sits on the west side of Detroit. Detroit borders it on three sides of our city.
It is a good mix of every different nationality background with a lot of culture in it.
Just before midnight, a man driving along Interstate 94 spots a terrifying sight. A woman, obviously badly hurt, running across the highway and waving her arms for help.
She was saying, hey, I'm been kidnapped. I need help immediately. They're going to come back and kill me. She just kept saying, they're going to kill me. They're going to kill me.
The woman jumps into the man's car and begs for help. Thankfully, there's a gas station still open at the bottom of the off-ramp.
Detroit police officers just happened to be at the gas station when this car pulled up, and the gentleman got out and said, I have this girl. She just jumped in my car. She said she was kidnapped. Police started looking at him, believing he might have been involved somehow, because her injuries were so extensive that they just couldn't believe this story that they were hearing.
Officers turn to the injured woman and try to get more information about what's happened.
The injured woman identified herself as 21-year-old LaToya Britton.
LaToya was born in the Detroit area and was raised by her mother. As a teenager, she never had trouble making friends.
I met LaToya in 8th grade, and since then, me and LaToya have been thick as thieves, best friends.
LaToya and Patricia, they spent a lot of time together, you know, going to dinner, talking to boys, dressing alike, all the things the teenage girls did, they did together, and they were inseparable. LaToya came from a one-parent home. It was just her mother raising her. So she did happen to spend quite a bit of time at our home.
We was, man, like sisters. She called my mama and daddy, mama and daddy. She was the first person I told I was pregnant. She was the only one I knew. He was like 15.
With the baby's father out of the picture, Patricia leaned on LaToya for support.
Most girls would say, you know what, we're not on the same level anymore. But she just maintained that friendship, that bond with Patricia.
Patricia also relied on her close and loving family.
We had a beautiful bungalow house, me and my mom, my dad. That was nice. I just went to school, took my baby to daycare, and I had support of my mom and dad.
A lot of times when we think about young mothers who haven't finished high school, they feel like, oh, my life is over, I have to raise a child, there's nothing left for me. But Patricia wasn't that way. She still wanted to finish high school.
I'm getting older. I didn't want to live with my parents anymore. I wanted to provide. I wanted to work. I decided I love to cook. By then, I was working at the hospital as a cook.
Living on her own, Patricia still stayed tight with her folks, and together they found a new church.
I was active in church, she was active in church, and we just was there, a permanent fixture.
For Patricia, church soon became about more than just a rousing sermon. There was also a handsome man who caught her eye.
Nice looking guy, tall, brown skinned, muscular, very well dressed, smelled so good.
Patricia sees Terrell Smith in church and thought that she may have found a good one this time. He's into church and he's interacting with her young son.
I thought that he was a real respectful young man. He had a strong faith in God. He was always there. Just a nice young man.
While Patricia and LaToya were carving their own paths, they managed to stay in touch.
For them to still be friends after all of that time says a lot about their relationship and the love they have for each other.
But now, police want to know how LaToya wound up riddled with injuries in the back of a man's vehicle.
That driver I had interviewed, he was immediately looked at as a suspect by Detroit Police Department until he was able to be cleared when LaToya confirmed his story.
Officers aren't able to get much information from LaToya before she's rushed to the hospital, but they alert dispatch that she's on her way.
I got a call in the middle of the night that a young lady had been kidnapped and that my team and I needed to respond and find out what happened to her.
At the time, the information that I was provided is that a male and a female subject had kidnapped another female subject, had placed her in the trunk of the car, and were driving her eastbound on I-94 from the city of Dearborn into the city of Detroit. And at some point during this incident, the female that was in the trunk of the car popped the trunk using the emergency hatch and was able to jump out of the car onto I-94.
Detectives arrive at the hospital hoping LaToya can provide more information about her kidnappers.
She was completely distraught when we first saw her. She was all bandaged up along her arms and her legs. She had cuts along her face. She had just jumped from a car doing approximately 70 miles an hour down the expressway, timing it not to get hit by other cars. So the road rash on her was terrible.
LaToya can barely speak, but what she does say shocks Detective Wilson.
LaToya immediately said this was my best friend who did this to me, Patricia Jernigan, and her boyfriend Terrell.
In the early morning hours of October 18th, 2015, Dearborn detectives are trying to piece together what happened to 21-year-old LaToya Britton. LaToya claims she was kidnapped by two people, Terrell Smith and her own best friend, Patricia Jernigan.
She's describing her best friend and her best friend's boyfriend capturing her, and he had a gun in hand. The initial conversation with LaToya was very minimal. It was more about taking care of her injuries and working on the information that we had. She said that her cell phone was taken from her. So step one was locate the cell phone, locate Patricia, and locate Terrell. We didn't know if Patricia was a victim in this case or if she was a willing participant. So the goal was to make sure she was safe, because the initial information that we had from LaToya was Terrell was the one with a gun.
I started contacting the cell phone providers to get call detail records as well as their cell tower location information.
While the forensics team works on tracking LaToya Britton's cell phone, Detective Wilson heads over to speak to LaToya, who was just released from the hospital.
The follow-up interview was done in her living room. She was still dealing with her significant injuries. I sat down in the chair in the living room there and spoke with her in detail about this. She starts telling me that Patricia has been her childhood best friend. Patricia was really doing well for herself, that she had a great family, and that once she had met Terrell, that things had just changed, that Terrell, he was very controlling.
Terrell insisted on knowing everything about Patricia's friends, especially LaToya.
She said that Terrell had always been jealous of their friendship, that there's no way that two females could be that close to each other, that have that good of a relationship or friendship. So there was always that jealousy that he harbored for LaToya.
LaToya says she wasn't comfortable with the situation and cut off all contact with Patricia. The two friends did not speak or text for months. Then, in mid-October of 2015, LaToya is contacted by her one-time best friend.
Patricia said she wanted to reconnect their friendship and go to dinner.
Patricia picks LaToya up from her home, and they're on their way to have dinner. Patricia stops the car down the street, and she's like, hey, let me put the restaurant in the GPS, which is normal.
Patricia had grabbed LaToya's cell phone when Terrell had came out of a set of bushes that were around a corner.
LaToya runs down the street. Terrell catches her and hits her in the head with the gun.
He had pushed LaToya into the trunk of the car at that point and had grabbed her breasts and had threatened her to the point where she was fearful and had to cooperate with his demands.
LaToya is saying how she's been forced into this trunk. There's no way that she knows where she's being taken to. She's thinking, I can scream and maybe somebody will hear me. However, she notices that they're turning the music up louder and louder. She's noticing the car is accelerating, so they can't hear, or anybody can't hear her screams.
She said that she was well aware that night she was going to die. Wherever Patricia and Terrell wanted to take her, she wasn't going to survive another day.
LaToya makes the choice that I would rather jump out of a moving vehicle than fear a person taking my life from me.
She remembered looking for that emergency latch in the trunk in order to pull it to hopefully save herself and be able to jump. And when she made that jump and she figured that the timing was safe enough, it's now or never, she was wearing a crossbody purse. The strap had actually caught onto the trunk, so she was dangling for a moment in time, and finally the strap broke. And that's when she was released and tumbled to the ground.
Hearing the details of LaToya's harrowing story raises the stakes for detectives.
The first thing that we do is look at the criminal history. Looking at Patricia's history, she had a very minimal history. There was no reason that she should be involved in something this heinous. But then looking forward at Terrell's history, criminal history, it was extensive. And in fact, he already had a conviction for a previous kidnapping.
On October 17th, 2015, a botched kidnapping left LaToya Britton physically and psychologically battered. The next morning, two suspects, Terrell Smith and Patricia Jernigan, are still on the loose, and detectives have only LaToya's missing cell phone to work with.
Initially, with the cell phone pings, we were able to get those under what's called exigent circumstances. And essentially at that point, what we are saying is that there is an emergency, that there's a risk of somebody being hurt and or killed, and that we need to find, this device because we believe it's going to lead us to the suspects.
But someone had turned LaToya's phone off, so there was no way to track the device. Investigators turned to social media as a possible way to find the suspect's location.
In this case, when we were able to serve the search warrant on to the social media sites, we asked them to expedite it due to the nature of the crime, and that we needed to find these people right away, which they were able to do for us.
In the early morning hours of October 19th, the local internet service provider contacts detectives with an IP address that is pinging from inside of a residence located on Detroit's east side.
Once we received this information back from the providers, we in turn gave it to our undercover officers.
Several Detroit PD units quickly scramble and race to the address to get into position.
Our undercover crew was watching the house and monitoring any movement that was taking place in the house. That's when they were able to see Terrell, but without him coming out of the house, there was no way to make a safe approach into the house, knowing that Terrell was armed with a handgun.
Just after 1 p.m., detectives observe Terrell drive away in a silver Neon, registered to Patricia Jernigan.
At that point, our undercover team that was watching the house had begun to follow and tail him, calling out every move that he made, every turn. Most people, when they're being followed, are completely unaware, except for he kept looking over his shoulders. You could tell that he was paranoid.
Terrell pulls into a business parking lot and parks near the building.
The parking lot was an area that was ideal for pulling in the undercover cars to surround his car and pin him in. He was taken out of the car and immediately placed on the ground. There wasn't a weapon on him at that point.
As Terrell is taken into custody, Patricia suddenly walks out into the parking lot. Terrell was there to pick her up from work.
Then Patricia came out to see what was happening.
Police came. I seemed like they came out of everywhere. And they screaming, yelling, "I'm under arrest."
And that's when she was brought over to my car. I asked to have a conversation with her about why we were there and what was going on. And we sat down and had a basic girl conversation of what's going on and what information do you have for us.
Yeah, she's like, "You're free to leave, you're not under arrest." It's the only thing I remember. And I remember I kept asking, "I gotta get my son." And she's like, "We gonna let you get your son?"
Patricia's demeanor, I mean, she was nervous. You could hear her voice shaking. You could see the nerves on her. She knew that she needed to give me some sort of story.
First thing is like, don't tell her the truth, lie. You know, lie, maybe she'll let you go. Because I didn't know, never been in trouble, so it's like, I didn't know.
She said that LaToya had agreed to go to dinner with her and that she was picking her up. There was an argument over some money that LaToya had asked for a cell phone bill. There was some pushing and shoving that occurred, and Patricia had pushed LaToya out of the car, but she denied Terrell's involvement at all during that interaction.
Detectives ask Patricia if she'll come with them to the station for further questioning.
She was quiet the entire ride back to the police department that she agreed to go to. She just sat there quietly and she kept asking about her son. Her son was her biggest priority. She wanted to get home to her son. She appeared to be remorseful, but she appeared to be very scared and nervous.
On the way to the police station, detectives make Patricia an offer.
I told her that I'd be willing to give her a polygraph in order to clear her from this, in order to see if her story was going to pan out. A truthful person is going to immediately jump all over a polygraph exam. In Patricia's case, she was forthcoming and said, "No, I'm not going to pass this polygraph test."
Two days after the kidnapping of LaToya Britton, suspects Terrell Smith and Patricia Jernigan are both in custody of the Dearborn police. But only Terrell has been placed under arrest.
At that point, she hadn't done anything to place herself in a position where she would be under arrest, but she knew that we needed to talk further. So she agreed to come back to the Dearborn police station where we drove her.
At the Dearborn headquarters, Detective Wilson sits down alone with Patricia.
It's just Patricia and I having this conversation, and at this time she begins to open up more. She knew that there were some issues that were going on. So she basically recounts the whole incident as LaToya tells me.
Help! I remember that night. I never forget this night. I had to get drunk because because I was so out of it. I did not want to do it, but I was stuck between this rock and this hard place. I remember driving over there, and I remember texting her, like, I'm outside.
She says that they were going to go to dinner, that Terrell had went to Dollar General to purchase a toy gun because the intention was to get that money that LaToya was borrowing back. She described that this was the plan, to kidnap her, that she was in on the gun being involved, that she had dropped Terrell off initially in those bushes in order for him to rob her, to point this toy gun in her face.
Patricia tells detectives that once Terrell got in the car, things escalated quickly.
I remember her just screaming and crying like, Trish, for real, Trish, for real. And I'm trying to call it off like, Terrell, leave her alone, just stop. Terrell, leave it alone, like, just stop, leave her alone. But by then, it seemed like everything raveling so fast. And I just remember her screaming. And I'm like, Terrell, let her go, just let her go. Just please let her go.
Patricia says it's then that Terrell forces LaToya into the trunk of the car and tells Patricia to keep driving.
And I just look, I see in the rearview mirror the trunk come up. And I heard a boom, boom, boom. And we get off on that first exit, maybe the second. And I see her running. I'm like, Terrell, just let her go, let her go, let her go. He get back up on the exit, trying to get her. By then, she gone.
It was very clear that Patricia was involved and not a victim at this point. As soon as she had said something that was self-incriminating, she was no longer free to leave.
That's the only thing I do remember. You know, Patricia, you're under arrest. And I just remember, like, can I call Mama to get my son? She's like, yeah, I called. And I called her for phone. I'm like, well, I guess they went to my mom's house looking for me. She's like, sweetie, what's going on? Where's LaToya? It's police is here. Nah, my mom hysterical crying. So I said, Mom, I'm gonna let the detective tell you.
And she told me, she said, your daughter is involved in a kidnapping. You know, it's serious charges. Patricia's got some serious things against her.
At the conclusion of our interview, she was handcuffed, she was walked downstairs to our booking area, and she was placed in a holding cell until she was formally charged.
On October 23, 2015, just 1 week after the kidnapping of LaToya Britton, Patricia Jernigan and Terrell Smith are arraigned together.
In that courtroom when they were being arraigned, the realization had come that she wasn't going home to her son, that she was in too deep because of this man.
We got arraigned, and I remember standing there next to him. They had us cuffed together. And I remember the judge like, Patricia, are you aware you standing next to a fourth-time habitual?
When Patricia first met Terrell Smith, he seemed like the perfect man for her.
I was in the middle of the church, and he came approaching me like, can I take him to the vending machine? I'm like, yeah. So I walked with him with Mari to the vending machine. Then he asked me, am I single? I'm like, yeah. He said, you know, you should call me. He said, but, stop like this. He said, but I just want to be honest with you. I'm just getting out of prison and I'm on tether. He's on GPS tether, which means he's being monitored and watched by his parole officer.
She believed that if God can forgive people, who are we not to forgive? You know, but I had, you know, my doubts. You know, this is my daughter, my baby.
He told me in the beginning that he got incarcerated for carjacking. Him and his girlfriend was into it. The car was in her name. He took the car, she reported it, but it was more to it.
Patricia never pressed Terrell on what really landed him in prison.
A lot of times, because you want something so bad, you tend to make excuses. So a lot of red flags are overlooked by the mentality of, I want what I want, so I will overlook that, and then maybe I can fix it.
Things seemed so right in the beginning. It seemed like, okay, Trish, this your person. And he was a gentleman, so respectable. Everything felt right.
Handcuffed together and standing just inches from Terrell, Patricia learns for the first time why he had been in prison before they met. Carrying a concealed weapon, firearm felony, carjacking, and unlawful imprisonment.
And I just remember crying, looked over at him, nothing. He didn't say nothing, no emotion.
Initially, both Patricia and Terrell were charged with the same crimes because of their involvement together. They were charged with kidnapping, torture, criminal sexual conduct in the second degree, and armed robbery.
At this point, I was telling her, sweetie, we just want you to do what is right. Cooperate. Tell the truth. But at this point, she still was not talking because Terrell was still in her head. And it took maybe a couple weeks of me going back and forth, getting in her ear, that she finally started breaking down and being honest of the extent of what had happened that night.
Finally, Patricia requests to meet with Detective Wilson one more time.
This is when she opened up more. She talked about the plan, that LaToya was going to be that conquest for Terrell, that she wanted to make her boyfriend happy. And she said the whole story about giving her money for the cell phone bill, that was all fabricated. That was just something to save herself during the initial interview with me. She talked about the abuse that she had endured through the years while dating Terrell. So she had seen his real gun before and was in fear of him. Her biggest fear was that if she didn't help him and participate and orchestrate this, that she would be killed alongside LaToya at the conclusion of this.
Prosecutors approach Patricia about a possible reduced sentence if she agrees to testify against Terrell Smith.
My lawyer said if I go to trial, I could get more time than him because he wasn't able to get to her if it wasn't for me. They said, you gotta testify, you gotta go to court, you gotta take the stand. I said, no, I can't do it. I can't do it. I was willing to take this 15.
Patricia Jernigan is being held in Wayne County Jail awaiting trial for the attempted kidnapping of LaToya Britton. Prosecutors have offered a reduced sentence if Patricia agrees to testify against Terrell Smith. But so far, she's been too terrified to take the stand against her ex-boyfriend.
I remember crying, talking to my mama, and I remember my mama saying, you know what, sweetie? If you're not trying to testify against him, don't worry about seeing your son. Me and your daddy would get custody of him. It's like, we done. And from that moment, that's when I got the courage to testify.
As prosecutors build a case against Terrell Smith, they learn more about how he was able to so quickly get Patricia on board with his twisted plan.
He wanted to try to prove himself to be that good young man who could be a father figure to Patricia's son.
But after Patricia and Terrell got an apartment together, the relationship turned quickly.
I noticed that he always wanted to see my phone, see who I'm texting, who am I talking to. If I didn't answer his phone call at a certain time or I missed a phone call, then it went from he wanted my Facebook passwords. So I did it, but then it got to him messaging people, seeing who am I talking to, messaging guys acting like me. It just got too much, and then we got to arguing about his controlling ways. And that's when I really saw that dark side of him.
While she was with Terrell, not only was he taking her employment money, her income tax money, her child care, he was taking her child support. He was taking that.
Yeah, I was questioning it. And I'm like, was this a good choice? Am I making the right decision? Like, sweetie, get out of it. But then, I'm on the other side, like, I love him, he loved me. Like, it get better, it get better, it get better. And it didn't. It started off as loving, Started loving, beautiful. Sex was normal. But as it progressed, it started being like it's forced. Terrell wanted to do threesomes. I wasn't experienced with that, you know? I didn't know. I wasn't into that. But I wanted to please him, wanted to satisfy him.
When the level of intimacy is introduced into any relationship, it then changes the dynamics for the person. A lot of times it's an uncomfortable feeling, but you negate that feeling because you're like, well, he loves me.
It went far as Terrell would meet women off different dating apps and bring them home. Then it went to him trying to get my friends, trying to talk to my friends. He been wanted LaToya. He had this sick obsession with her. He came up with this plan that he wanted LaToya.
Terrell wants to have not only control over Patricia's life, but he also wants to break LaToya.
Yeah, me and Toya stopped being friends because of Terrell. So he got to texting LaToya, acting like me. It was his phone number, but Toya didn't even know my phone number. It was him, acting like me and him broke up. I don't know, it's like he had a hold on me, like some ungodly hold on me.
Even behind the thick walls of jail, Terrell tries to control Patricia.
What he was doing in the interim between the arraignment and the trial, he somehow found a way to get messages to Patricia in jail to get her not to talk or to flip on him.
You still won't let me be free. You took so much from me. You still won't let me go.
Terrell's trial finally begins on April 13th, 2016. On the morning Patricia was scheduled to testify, she didn't think she could pull it off.
You get bonded over to Frank Murphy, the big court. I'm terrified, like, I'm scared. I just remember the bailiff, the officer opening the door. Are you ready? As I'm walking, I'm crying, and I stop. He said, you can do this. Because remember him telling me, you can do this. You're gonna be okay.
Facing charges of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, armed robbery, and criminal sexual conduct, Terrell Smith goes on trial in April of 2016. His former girlfriend and alleged co-conspirator, Patricia Jernigan, is the prosecution's star witness.
And they asked me this hard question was, what was he gonna do to her? And I told her, he was gonna rape her. He wanted me to watch. Toya, she screams, Trish. And that's when I just got to crying.
The entire truth behind it was that the plan was to kidnap, rape, and then kill LaToya. LaToya didn't know about it. Normally, if I know about it, I would give the victim a heads up. I didn't know until Patricia was up on that stand talking about it. So when it came out, LaToya's reaction was so raw, which made it even more raw for Patricia. The jury ended up finding Terrell guilty on all counts. He was subsequently sentenced to 42 to 65 years at the Michigan Department of Corrections that he's serving out in northern Michigan at this time.
In return for her testimony, Patricia is given a reduced sentence.
And the sentencing, the judge told Patricia what the verdict was. It had been passed down. And, her time would be 5 to 15 years. And we looking at her with tears. At this point, I've never seen my husband cry. He's looking at her with tears. I'm looking at her with tears. We're constrained. There's nothing we can do to help her.
I have this saying where I'm built to last. That's who I say I am. My first 2 years was hard. My first 2 years was hard. I lost my daddy. My daddy died. And the hardest thing is burying somebody in prison. That's the hardest thing ever. And I never got to apologize to my daddy. Like, I never got to deeply apologize to him. And I always had, like, this thing in my mind that, like, I put so much grief and burden on my daddy that helped kill him. Like, you think like that.
With good behavior and credit for time served, Patricia is eligible for parole after 4.5 years in prison.
I remember going to the parole agent, and I just remember, like, you want to get out of here? Just be honest. And he asked me, like, why are you here? And I told him. I said, I was so in love with this man. This man had such a hold on me that I didn't care about nothing or no one. I was willing to do any and everything for this man. And I remember his answer was like, that's it. He said, you got a question for me? I'm like, do I got my parole? He's like, yeah. And I'm like, oh, yes, after 5 years, I'm going home.
For Patricia, full recovery will take some time.
Why am I choosing to do it now? To help with my journey. I'm tired of, like, keeping this a secret. Because how am I ever going to heal for something if I'm keeping this a secret? Because he had messed me up in so many areas that I'm trying to still recover and rebuild myself as a woman.
Unfortunately, we see a lot of these circumstances to where women are put into positions to where they end up doing something that they don't necessarily want to do because of the actions of their partners.
She knew in her heart that it didn't feel right, but she couldn't reach out and she couldn't ask for that help. So I would just encourage people to reach out and ask for that help because it is there and it is available, and you don't have to be stuck in a situation like this.
With any woman, we have intuition. Learn how to stop ignoring your intuition. Learn how to ask for the things that you need.
For LaToya Britton, her journey to recovery is also just beginning.
For LaToya, I mean, this is something that will never go away. It will haunt her forever, not only mentally, but the physical scars that are on her.
Toya, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. That's all I can say. I'm sorry. I'd do anything to take that night back. I'd do it. But now it's just like, I guess silence is the best. Because now we're grown. We're 31. So it's like so much time has passed. And I just hope one day she could ever forgive me. One day.
When someone is blinded by passion, it can be all-consuming, causing all rationale to go out the window. When that happens, we can sacrifice the friendships we cherish most and imperil their lives. And once those ties are shattered, they may never be repaired.
The rain in Atlanta during the late summer of 1987 didn't wash anything clean. It only made the heat stickier, the shadows longer, and the secrets deeper. Midnight had long since bled into the early hours of an unseasonably muggy August Tuesday when the emergency dispatch line chimed at the Fulton County precinct. It was a single call, crisp and trembling, coming from a payphone situated just off Ponce-de-Leon Avenue. The voice on the other end didn't leave a name, didn't demand a ransom, and didn't wait for the dispatcher to ask for clarification. It simply offered 6 words before the line went dead. Check the cellar on Oakwood Street. When the first 2 patrol units rolled up to the designated address, the neighborhood of Oakwood Street was wrapped in a suffocating silence. It was a block defined by towering red brick homes built during the late Victorian era, many of them subdivided into cheap apartments or left to crumble quietly under thick veils of English ivy. Number 412 was one of the crumbling ones. The front porch sagged under the weight of rotting beams, and a solitary yellow porch light flickered with a rhythmic, dying buzz. Neighbors knew the house was supposed to be vacant. The elderly owner had passed away 18 months prior, leaving the property tied up in a probate dispute that had effectively frozen it in time. The officers unholstered their flashlights, their beams cutting through the heavy moisture hanging in the air. The front door was unlocked, resting open on its hinges by a fraction of an inch. Inside, the air smelled instantly of decay, stale wallpaper paste, and something metallic, an unmistakable stench that anyone in law enforcement learns to recognize instantly. They pushed forward into the living room, where sheeted furniture stood like pale ghosts in the dark. Dust lay thick on the hardwood floors, except for a single set of dragged tracks leading toward the back hallway, where a heavy wooden door stood half ajar, revealing a staircase descending into complete darkness. Every step down those wooden basement stairs creaked like a warning. The beam of the lead officer's light swept across concrete walls, rusted water heaters, and forgotten trunks. But at the far eastern corner of the basement, beneath a low-hanging joist, the light caught something out of place. A fresh mound of red Georgia clay had been shoveled over the original dirt floor. Resting atop that freshly churned dirt was a child's red plastic hairpin, reflecting the flashlight's glare like a drop of wet blood. Digging didn't take long. Less than 18 inches down, detectives uncovered a shallow, hastily improvised grave. The victim was young, a woman in her early 20s, wrapped in a blue industrial tarpaulin bound tightly with heavy nylon rope. The condition of the body indicated she had been dead for less than 48 hours. There was no identification, no purse, no shoes, and no wallet. The only physical markings were a silver chain around her neck bearing a broken crucifix pendant and a distinct, jagged surgical scar on her left wrist. By dawn, Oakwood Street was sealed off with miles of yellow crime scene tape. Media vans lined the curb, their high-wattage broadcasting lights clashing against the soft orange glow of the rising Atlanta sun. The local news broke the story within hours, blasting headlines across television screens. Mysterious body found in vacant Atlanta mansion. Police launch homicide probe. The neighborhood, usually sleepy and detached from the city's rising crime rates, was instantly plunged into paranoia. Who was the caller at the payphone? How did they know about the body? And most importantly, who was the woman buried under the floorboards of 412 Oakwood? The initial investigation moved with frantic momentum. Homicide detectives fanned out across the city, cross-referencing missing persons reports from across Georgia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas. Within 48 hours, they had a name: Elena Vance, a 22-year-old nursing student who had vanished 3 days earlier after leaving her late-night shift at Grady Memorial Hospital. Elena was described by friends as quiet, meticulous, and deeply dedicated to her studies. She had no known enemies, no history of substance abuse, and no tumultuous personal relationships. Her car, a beat-up blue Ford Pinto, was found parked 4 miles away from Oakwood Street, sitting in the long-term parking lot of an interstate bus terminal, unlocked, with her purse and keys resting undisturbed on the passenger seat. The scene at the bus terminal was an obvious staging attempt. The killer wanted police to believe Elena had fled the city voluntarily, a misdirection that fell apart the moment her body was exhumed from the basement. But the puzzle only grew more confusing when forensic pathologists completed the autopsy. Elena hadn't been shot, stabbed, or strangled in the traditional sense. The cause of death was asphyxiation, but toxicology reports revealed something far more chilling: high concentrations of a specialized veterinary sedative, a compound not available to the general public and tightly regulated even within medical circles. Detectives shifted their focus immediately toward local clinics, veterinary hospitals, and supply warehouses. They questioned dozens of medical personnel, audited supply logs, and interrogated Elena's co-workers at Grady Memorial. Hundreds of hours of interviews yielded nothing. Every lead dead-ended in a labyrinth of incomplete paperwork and vague assertions. The payphone call from Ponce de Leon Avenue was traced, but in 1987, without closed-circuit television cameras covering every street corner, the identity of the anonymous caller remained a complete ghost. No fingerprints were retrieved from the coin slot. No witnesses had seen anyone standing at the booth. Weeks stretched into months, and the initial wave of media panic began to cool. The headlines moved from the front page to the inner sections of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, shrinking in size with every passing week. Police swept through every known associate of Elena Vance, including an ex-boyfriend who provided a bulletproof alibi backed by 3 independent witnesses, and a strange neighbor who had been seen hanging around her apartment building, but whose physical evidence failed to match anything recovered from the tarpaulin or the rope. By late 1988, the case had turned ice cold. The thick yellow case file was closed, labeled with a red stamp, and transferred from the active homicide desk down to the basement archives of the precinct, ironically placed in a cold, dim room not unlike the cellar where Elena's body had been discovered. Year after year, new homicides took priority. New violence swept through the city, and the file on Oakwood Street gathered dust, becoming just another tragic ghost story whispered among veteran detectives during late-night shift changes. For 2 decades, the murder of Elena Vance was viewed as an unsolvable crime, a masterclass in cold-blooded calculation where the perpetrator had vanished without leaving a single trace of usable physical evidence. The technology of 1987 simply wasn't equipped to read the microscopic whispers left behind at the scene. The rope, the tarpaulin, the soil, and the broken silver crucifix were packed into cardboard evidence boxes, sealed with heavy brown tape, and left to sit on metal shelves in a climate-controlled warehouse on the outskirts of Fulton County. Then came the turning point that no one in 1987 could have anticipated. Decades later, the field of forensic science underwent a seismic revolution. The emergence of advanced short tandem repeat (STR) DNA testing, coupled with the rising science of touch DNA and forensic genetic genealogy, began turning forgotten cold cases upside down across the nation. Crimes that had lain dormant for 30, 40, or 50 years were suddenly being blown wide open by invisible cellular material left on items that had sat untouched in evidence lockers for generations. In early 2024, a newly formed cold case task force inside the Fulton County District Attorney's Office initiated a systematic review of unsolved homicides from the late 1980s. Heading the initiative was Detective Marcus Thorne, a veteran investigator known for his obsessive attention to detail and a relentless refusal to let dead cases stay buried. Thorne pulled the box labeled Vance, Elena, 1987 from the bottom shelf of the archive room. When Thorne cut the old brown tape on evidence box 87 to 4092, he didn't just find physical items. He found a timeline frozen in amber. Inside were the original crime scene photos, stark, black and white images capturing the dark dampness of the Oakwood Street basement, the frayed edges of the blue tarpaulin, and the pristine, unbroken knots tied in the nylon rope. Thorne realized that while detectives in 1987 had focused heavily on fingerprints and blood typing, both of which had yielded dead ends due to environmental degradation in the damp cellar, they had carefully preserved the knots of the nylon rope. In modern forensics, knots are gold mines. To tie a complex knot tightly under pressure, a perpetrator must grip the cordage with significant force, often transferring skin cells through friction and sweat deep into the fibers of the rope where environmental moisture cannot easily reach them. The evidence was recatalogued and sent under strict chain of custody protocols to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GEI, forensic lab. Using modern, high-sensitivity extraction techniques, technicians painstakingly unraveled the nylon knots, swabbing the inner fibers that had been sealed off from light, air, and moisture since the night of the murder in August 1987. For weeks, the lab worked in silence. Then, the call came through to Detective Thorne's desk. The lab hadn't just found partial DNA. They had extracted a pristine, full-profile male DNA strand from the deep core of the main knot. The profile was immediately run through the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the national database containing millions of offender profiles. The result was a resounding, frustrating silence. No match found. The killer had never been convicted of a federal or state crime that required a DNA sample submission in the years following 1987. Mainstream law enforcement efforts hit a wall, but Thorne refused to let the lead die. He authorized the transfer of the DNA profile to a specialized private laboratory specializing in forensic genetic genealogy, FGG. Genetic genealogists took the raw DNA data and uploaded it to public consumer databases like GeneMatch and Family Tree DNA, building vast, intricate family trees backwards through time, searching for shared segments of DNA among distant cousins, great-aunts, and second uncles. The genealogical web was vast, stretching across 3 generations and spanning multiple states from South Carolina to Ohio. For months, analysts pieced together census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and high school yearbooks, slowly narrowing down the branches of a single, sprawling family tree toward a specific lineage that had resided in the Atlanta metropolitan area during the mid to late 1980s. By the autumn of 2025, the genealogy team had narrowed the list of hundreds of potential relatives down to 3 brothers who were all in their 20s and living in Atlanta in August 1987. 2 of the brothers had passed away in the early 2010s, but their medical records and surviving children allowed investigators to rule them out genetically. That left one surviving suspect. His name was Arthur Pendleton. In 1987, Pendleton had been a 26-year-old delivery driver for an industrial medical supply company, a company whose regular delivery routes included Grady Memorial Hospital and several local veterinary surgical centers. At the time of the original investigation, Pendleton's name had appeared briefly on a list of hundreds of delivery drivers interviewed during the audit of the stolen veterinary sedative. However, because he had no criminal record and his employer verified that he was off duty on the night Elena vanished, he was dismissed as a routine contact and never questioned a second time. In late 2025, Arthur Pendleton was 64 years old, living a quiet, unremarkable life in a suburban subdivision in Alpharetta, Georgia. He was married, retired, served as a deacon at a local church, and was widely regarded by his neighbors as an unassuming, gentle old man who spent his weekends gardening and fixing vintage radios in his garage. To bridge the gap between a genealogical match and a legally binding arrest warrant, Thorne needed a direct, fresh sample of Pendleton's DNA to compare against the profile recovered from the rope fibers. A covert surveillance team was deployed to monitor Pendleton's movements. For 6 days, undercover officers followed him as he ran errands, visited hardware stores, and picked up groceries. The break came on a rainy Thursday afternoon outside a diner in Roswell. Pendleton finished a cup of coffee, wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, and discarded a plastic straw and the paper napkin into a trash bin outside the restaurant entrance. Within seconds of Pendleton driving away, an undercover detective retrieved the discarded items, sealed them in biohazard bags, and rushed them to the GBI laboratory. 48 hours later, the lab results were finalized. The probability that the DNA found on the rope tied around Elena Vance in 1987 belonged to anyone other than Arthur Pendleton was calculated at 1 in 10 billion. The trap was ready to spring. The morning of November 14, 2025, began in Alpharetta with a bitter, bone-chilling fog that rolled over the manicured lawns and double-car garages of the Oak Ridge Estates subdivision. It was the kind of suburban neighborhood where nothing ever happened, where neighbors waved across driveway pavement, and where streetlights flickered on at precisely 5:30 every evening. But as the clock struck 6 o'clock, the serenity of the cul-de-sac was shattered by the muffled roar of 4 black, unmarked SUVs navigating the mist without headlights. Inside the lead vehicle, Detective Marcus Thorne checked the action on his service sidearm one last time before slipping it back into its leather holster. Beside him sat Detective Sarah Miller, a former tactical operator whose sharp eyes stayed fixed on the 2-story brick house at 1104 Pinehurst Way. The home belonged to Arthur Pendleton. For 38 years, Pendleton had walked among the citizens of Georgia as a ghost, an invisible phantom who had buried a young woman's body in a damp cellar and then seamlessly returned to a life of quiet suburban mundane existence. Today, the illusion was coming to an abrupt, violent end. The tactical team deployed with silent, practiced precision. Body armor clanked softly in the cold air as officers took positions around the perimeter, sealing off the backyard, the side alley, and the adjoining tree line. Thorne and Miller moved up the front porch steps, their boots making no sound on the wet welcome mat. Thorne didn't ring the doorbell. He didn't knock politely. With a heavy wooden ram, the breach team struck the front door right beside the deadbolt. The door splintered inward with a crack like a gunshot, echoing through the quiet neighborhood and waking the birds in the surrounding pine trees. "Police! Search warrant!" Down on the floor, shouted the entry team as they swarmed the foyer. Inside, the house smelled of freshly brewed coffee, cinnamon, and old paper. Arthur Pendleton was standing in his kitchen, wearing an oversized flannel bathrobe and holding a ceramic mug. He didn't scream. He didn't try to run. He didn't drop his coffee. He simply froze, his blue eyes widening in sudden, terrifying recognition as tactical shields rounded the corner into the dining room. As officers forced him down onto the hardwood floor and pulled his arms behind his back to snap the steel handcuffs onto his wrists, Pendleton looked up at Detective Thorne. His face didn't register anger or shock, only a profound, hollow exhaustion, as if a weight he had carried for 4 decades had suddenly flattened him. "Is it about the girl?" Pendleton whispered, his voice barely audible over the chatter of police radios filling his living room. "Is it about the girl in Atlanta?" Thorne knelt down beside the old man, his voice ice-cold and steady. "Her name was Elena Vance, Arthur. And you've been running for 38 years. News of the arrest hit the Atlanta media like an artillery shell. Within hours, live broadcast trucks parked along Pinehurst Way, their satellite dishes raised toward the gray sky. Suburban mothers stopped on their morning jogs, staring in disbelief at the police tape surrounding the home of a man who had served on the neighborhood HOA board, fixed their children's bicycles, and organized the annual summer block party. The headline sent shockwaves across the country. 1987 cold case breakthrough. Suburban Atlanta deacon arrested for brutal cold case murder. At the precinct, Pendleton was ushered through the rear entrance, away from the flashing cameras and shouting reporters jostling against the barricades. He was brought to Interrogation Room B, a windowless space with concrete walls, a scuffed wooden table, and a two-way mirror reflecting the stark fluorescent lights overhead. Thorne sat across from him, laying out a thick manila folder labeled Vance, Elena, 1987. Beside the folder, Thorne placed 3 high-resolution photographs, one of Elena Vance smiling at her nursing school graduation, one of the knot tied in the blue tarpaulin found in the cellar, and one of the paper napkin Pendleton had tossed into a diner trash can 48 hours prior. For the first 2 hours, Pendleton said nothing. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, staring at the floor, refusing the water offered by the detectives. But Thorne knew how to break a man who had lived 4 decades behind a lie.
He didn't yell.
He didn't slam his fists on the table. Instead, Thorne slowly read through the forensic reports, laying out the undeniable mathematical reality of modern DNA profiling. He explained the genealogical mapping, the match from the rope fibers, and the irrefutable link between the tissue paper in the trash and the evidence preserved in Box 87 to 4092. "The science doesn't lie, Arthur," Thorne said gently, leaning forward over the table. "You left your mark on that rope. You left your mark on her. You thought the damp earth in that basement would destroy it, but time caught up with you. The only thing left for you to decide today is whether you die in prison as a monster who hid behind a lie, or as a man who finally had the courage to tell the truth." A long, heavy silence stretched across the room. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Pendleton's shoulders began to tremble, his hands shaking so violently that the cuffs rattled against his wrist bones. He pulled his eyes away from the photograph of Elena Vance and looked directly at Thorne. Tears welled up in his faded blue eyes, cutting clean tracks through the dust on his wrinkled cheeks. "I thought I had buried it," Pendleton whimpered, his voice cracking with age. I thought God had forgiven me because the police never came. But every time I closed my eyes in the dark, I was back in that basement. I was always back in that basement." What followed over the next 4 hours was a chilling, minute-by-minute confession that filled 3 cassette tapes and sent cold shivers down the spines of the detectives watching behind the two-way mirror. Pendleton didn't just confess to the murder of Elena Vance. He pulled back the curtain on a terrifying, double life that no one in his inner circle had ever suspected. In the summer of 1987, Pendleton was a 26-year-old delivery driver for Southeastern Medical Logistics. He was quiet, socially awkward, and harboring an intense, unspoken obsession with Elena Vance, whom he had seen routinely during his scheduled medical supply deliveries to the emergency ward at Grady Memorial Hospital. He learned her shift schedules, noted the times she took her break, and began following her discreetly after work in his private vehicle, a beige station wagon that never drew suspicion. On the night of August 11, 1987, Pendleton executed a calculated, predatory plan. Knowing Elena finished her nursing shift at midnight, he intercepted her in the parking lot, using his delivery credentials and a fabricated story about an urgent medical package meant for her supervisor to lure her near his vehicle. When she realized something was wrong, Pendleton ambushed her, using a rag soaked in a stolen liquid veterinary sedative, a potent chemical compound he had quietly diverted from a logistics shipment 3 weeks earlier. Elena was rendered unconscious within seconds. Pendleton loaded her into the back of his vehicle, driving her through the dark streets of Atlanta toward the abandoned Victorian property on Oakwood Street, a house he knew was completely vacant because his logistics company had previously managed medical equipment clearance for the deceased former owner. In the subterranean darkness of the Oakwood Street basement, the nightmare deepened. When Elena began to regain consciousness, Pendleton panicked. Fearing that she would recognize his face from her daily hospital shifts and report him to the police, he made the cold, brutal decision to eliminate her. He bound her tightly with industrial blue tarpaulins and heavy nylon cord he had taken from his delivery van, securing the knots with methodical, tight double hitches. To ensure she wouldn't survive, he administered a lethal overdose of the veterinary compound directly into her system. When she ceased moving, Pendleton retrieved a flathead shovel from his trunk and dug a crude, shallow grave into the damp Georgia clay in the dark corner of the cellar. He covered her body, threw her personal belongings into a nearby trash incinerator miles away, and abandoned her vehicle at the interstate bus terminal to frame the narrative of a runaway young woman fleeing the city. "Why call the police from the payphone on Ponce de Leon?" Detective Miller asked, leaning into the light. "If you wanted to get away with it, why make that phone call?" Pendleton leaned back in his chair, his gaze floating toward the ceiling as if watching a film projected in his mind. "Guilt," he murmured. "It hit me 2 days later like a physical blow. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I was terrified her family would never find her body, that she would just rot down there in the dark forever. I went to that payphone at 2 a.m, held my breath, and dropped the tip. I thought if they found her, maybe her mother could at least bury her properly. But then I saw the police vans on the news. I saw the yellow tape. I panicked, packed my bags, got a new job 3 months later, and moved across town. And then, nobody ever came to my door." The confession was meticulous, accurate, and contained details about the crime scene that had never been released to the public or the media, including the exact layout of the basement, the specific brand of veterinary sedative used, and the placement of the child's hairpin resting on the clay, which turned out to be an item Elena had carried in her pocket as a lucky charm given to her by her younger sister. By midnight, the interrogation was complete. Pendleton signed a 50-page formal confession, waiving his right to trial appeals in exchange for the prosecution removing the death penalty from the table, guaranteeing he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars without the possibility of parole. The news of the confession swept through the city of Atlanta like a wildfire. Front-page headlines were printed across the nation. 38-year-old Atlanta cold case closed. Killer confesses to 1987 murder of nursing student. For the local community, the news brought a complex mix of absolute relief and profound horror. The mysterious shadow that had hung over Oakwood Street for nearly 4 decades was finally dispelled, but the realization that a cold-blooded murderer had lived peacefully among them as a trusted neighbor, church deacon, and friend was a bitter pill to swallow. For the family of Elena Vance, the news came as an emotional earthquake. Elena's mother had passed away in 2012, dying without ever knowing who had stolen her daughter's life. But her younger sister, Clara Vance, now a 52-year-old high school teacher living in Savannah, received the late-night telephone call from Detective Thorne with tears streaming down her face. For 38 years, we thought she had been forgotten, Clara told reporters during an emotional press conference outside the Fulton County Courthouse the following morning. Every year on August 11th, we lit a candle for Elena. We wondered if the man who took her was dead, or if he was walking past us on the street. Today, we finally have our answer. Science, persistence, and the stubborn dedication of investigators who refused to let my sister be just a forgotten file in a basement brought us justice. The legal proceedings moved with swift, uncompromising severity. 2 months later, in January 2026, Arthur Pendleton was brought into a packed Fulton County courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles. Friends, family members, former co-workers of Elena Vance, and curious citizens filled every bench in the gallery. The air was thick with tension as Superior Court Judge Evelyn Mercer took the bench. Pendleton stood before the court, his head bowed, refusing to make eye contact with Clara Vance, who sat in the front row holding a framed photograph of her sister. When asked by the judge if he had anything to say before sentencing was passed, Pendleton shook his head slowly, his voice barely audible. "No, Your Honor. There are no words that can undo what I did. I accept my punishment." Judge Mercer didn't hold back her indignation. "Arthur Pendleton, you spent 38 years enjoying the simple pleasures of life, birthdays, holidays, sunshine, and freedom, privileges you violently ripped away from Elena Vance when she had her whole life ahead of her. You hid behind the mask of an innocent, respectable citizen, leaving a family to mourn in perpetual darkness. The law may spare your physical life today, but it will ensure that you spend every remaining breath you have confined within 4 concrete walls, stripped of the freedom you stole from another." With a strike of her wooden gavel, Judge Mercer rendered the final judgment: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served at the maximum security Georgia State Prison in Reedsville. As bailiffs led the frail, 64-year-old man out through the side door of the courtroom, a heavy silence fell over the room, a silence that felt fundamentally different from the heavy, terrifying silence that had hung over the Oakwood Street basement for nearly 40 years. It was the quiet closure of a chapter finally written to its end. Outside the courthouse, Detective Marcus Thorne stood on the stone steps, looking out over the Atlanta skyline as the afternoon sun broke through the winter clouds. In his hands, he held the original cardboard evidence box, Box 87 to 4092, now officially stamped with a large, black seal that read, "Case closed." The murder of Elena Vance was no longer an unsolved enigma. It was no longer a ghost story whispered in precinct hallways or a mysterious headline archived in old newspaper clippings. The long-buried evidence, a single strand of microscopic code locked deep within the fibers of an old nylon rope, had survived rain, decay, and the passage of nearly 4 decades to deliver a final, unyielding truth. The lesson of Oakwood Street was clear: time may pass, memories may fade, and evidence may sit buried in darkness under layers of Georgia clay or inside dusty archive boxes, but justice is patient. It waits in the shadows, listening to the whisper of science, until the day comes when even the oldest, coldest secrets are pulled into the light, sealing the fate of those who thought they had gotten away with murder. The steel door of cell block C at the Georgia State Prison swung shut with a heavy, reverberating metallic clang that echoed through the damp concrete corridors like thunder. For Arthur Pendleton, now inmate number 000094821, that final sound was the absolute end of the world he had spent 38 years carefully constructing. The suburban home on Pinehurst Way, the weekend backyard barbecues, the quiet mornings in his garden, and the pristine reputation as a devoted church deacon were instantly reduced to ashes. The reality of his new existence was 6 by 8 feet of cold, painted cinderblock, a stainless steel toilet, a narrow bunk with a paper-thin mattress, and the unyielding glare of a fluorescent strip light that never truly turned off. In the immediate aftermath of Pendleton's conviction and sentencing, the story of the Oakwood Street murder did not quietly fade from public consciousness. Instead, it sent massive shockwaves through the law enforcement community and the legal system across the entire United States. The swift, unequivocal resolution of a 38-year-old cold case through cutting-edge forensic genetic genealogy became a historic precedent. Law enforcement agencies from coast to coast realized that the passage of time was no longer a shield for perpetrators who believed they had successfully covered their tracks. At the Fulton County Police Department, the atmosphere in the homicide division had shifted dramatically. Detective Marcus Thorne sat at his desk late into the evening, surrounded by stacks of newly pulled cold case folders. On the corner of his desk rested the empty cardboard evidence container from the Elena Vance case, Box 87 to 4092, now permanently stamped with bold red ink, resolved/conviction secured. What had begun as a desperate, long-shot effort to extract usable cellular material from a frayed, 38-year-old piece of nylon rope had completely revolutionized the department's approach to historic unsolved crimes. The phone on Thorne's desk rang incessantly. District attorneys, chief detectives, and state investigators from Tennessee, Florida, Alabama, and South Carolina were calling with a single, urgent request. They wanted to consult with Thorne's specialized task force. They wanted to know how his team had bypassed decades of environmental degradation, how they had navigated the complex legal hurdles of consumer DNA database mapping, and how they had meticulously constructed an airtight chain of custody that forced a hardened, hidden killer into an absolute, recorded confession within 4 hours of his arrest. "We created a blueprint," Thorne remarked to Detective Sarah Miller as they reviewed a new queue of unsolved files from the early 1980s. For almost 40 years, guys like Pendleton slept soundly because they thought the clock had run out on us. They thought the rain, the dirt, and the rotting wood had destroyed every shred of proof. But technology finally caught up with their arrogance. The message we sent with the Vance case is simple. If you committed a murder in this city, it doesn't matter if it was yesterday or 40 years ago. We are coming for you. Meanwhile, 300 miles away in the coastal city of Savannah, Georgia, the ripple effects of the case brought a deeply emotional, bittersweet resolution to the surviving family of Elena Vance. Clara Vance sat in the quiet living room of her home, surrounded by photo albums that had sat untouched on top shelves for decades. For nearly 4 decades, Clara had lived with a hollow, aching void in her chest, a constant, suffocating uncertainty that made every family gathering, every holiday, and every quiet moment feel incomplete. Looking at a framed photograph of her older sister smiling on a beach in Tybee Island in the summer of 1986, Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes. Not tears of fresh grief, but tears of profound, long overdue catharsis. For 38 years, her family had been trapped in a terrible limbo, plagued by unanswered questions that haunted their dreams. Why Elena? Did she suffer? Who took her away? Was her killer still walking the streets, watching them from afar? Now, those questions had concrete, unyielding answers. The monster was no longer an invisible, terrifying shadow haunting the back corridors of her mind. He was a pathetic, frail old man locked inside a maximum security prison cell, stripped of his name, his freedom, and his reputation. The truth had finally liberated Elena's memory from the dark, damp cellar on Oakwood Street, restoring her identity as a bright, compassionate nursing student whose life mattered, whose story counted, and whose justice had been fiercely fought for by people who refused to let her be forgotten. In the weeks following the trial, investigative journalists began digging deeper into the background of Arthur Pendleton, attempting to unpack the psychology of a man who could commit such a calculated, atrocious act of violence and then seamlessly transition into 4 decades of quiet, law-abiding suburban domesticity. How could a serial predator, or a one-time killer, simply turn off his destructive impulses? How could a man live with the secret knowledge of a young woman's buried corpse while serving as an active member of his local church and offering friendly advice to his neighbors? Local media outlets aired special investigative reports titled The Mask of Sanity, The Dual Life of Arthur Pendleton. Former coworkers from Southeastern Medical Logistics were interviewed, recalling Pendleton as a polite, excessively quiet delivery driver who rarely spoke about his personal life, never raised his voice, and meticulously organized his delivery route ledgers. Neighbors from Oak Ridge Estates spoke to reporters in hushed, stunned tones, recalling how Pendleton had helped them shovel snow from their driveways, brought soup to sick neighbors, and participated in community watch meetings, ironically offering suggestions on how to improve neighborhood security and keep families safe from crime. "It makes your skin crawl," said one neighbor who had lived 2 doors down from Pendleton for 15 years. "To think that while we were standing in our yards talking about lawnmowers or weather, that man was carrying the secret of a murdered girl in his head. He looked like an ordinary grandfather. He acted like an ordinary grandfather." It proves that evil doesn't always wear a scary face. Sometimes it wears a flannel cardigan and smiles at you over the garden fence. Back inside the walls of the Fulton County DA's office, the successful prosecution of the Vance cold case sparked a broader movement within the state legislature. Inspired by Detective Thorne's relentless work and the undeniable power of forensic genetic genealogy, state lawmakers introduced the Elena Vance Cold Case Initiative, a landmark piece of legislation designed to secure dedicated state funding for the continuous retesting of physical evidence in unsolved homicides across Georgia using advanced DNA technology. The legislation aimed to ensure that every evidence locker in every precinct across the state would be systematically audited, cataloged, and processed through modern genetic databases, giving hundreds of grieving families the same chance at closure that Clara Vance had finally received. On the afternoon the bill officially passed into law, Detective Thorne was invited to the state capitol in downtown Atlanta to attend the ceremonial signing. Standing alongside Clara Vance and the Georgia governor, Thorne looked out at the assembled press corps, holding the small silver crucifix pendant that had been recovered from Elena's body in the Oakwood Street basement in 1987. The chain was broken, but the metal still shone brightly under the auditorium lights, a physical emblem of resilience that had survived 4 decades of dark, damp obscurity to stand as a symbol of ultimate triumph over evil. "This law is Elena's legacy," Clara Vance stated into the bank of microphones, her voice strong and unwavering. "My sister's life was cut short in a dark basement by a coward who thought he could hide behind the passage of time. But her spirit never died. Today, her name becomes a beacon of hope for every mother, every father, every brother, and every sister who is still sitting in the dark, waiting for a phone call, waiting for justice. To those families, I say, do not give up. The truth is coming." As the winter sun began to set over the city of Atlanta, casting long, golden shadows across the concrete steps of the courthouse, Detective Thorne walked back toward the precinct building on Ponce de Leon Avenue. He passed the corner where the old payphone booth had once stood in 1987, the spot where a young, panicked Arthur Pendleton had placed a trembling midnight phone call to emergency dispatch after burying his victim under the Georgia clay. The payphone was long gone, replaced by modern streetlights, glass storefronts, and busy urban traffic, but the ghost of that August night seemed to hover in the cool winter air. Thorne paused for a moment on the sidewalk, looking down at the pavement, reflecting on the long, winding road that had brought an unsolved tragedy from the cold archives of the past into the bright, unyielding light of justice. The case of Elena Vance was officially closed, but its impact would resonate through the hallways of justice for generations to come. It was a definitive testament to the power of modern science, the tenacity of dedicated investigators, and the unshakable truth that no matter how deep a secret is buried, no matter how many years pass, and no matter how quiet the killer remains, the truth will always find a way to drag the dark into the light. In the high-security wing of Georgia State Prison, the lights dimmed for the evening bed check. Inside cell 114, Arthur Pendleton lay awake on his iron cot, staring up at the bare concrete ceiling. The noise of the prison, the clanging bars, The shouting inmates, the echoing footsteps of the guards, gradually faded into the background, replaced by the relentless, quiet beating of his own heart. He closed his eyes, but there was no escape, no comfort, and no peace. The mask of the respectable citizen had been stripped away forever. All that remained was the dark, damp cellar on Oakwood Street, the memory of a young nurse's broken crucifix, and the terrifying knowledge that he would spend the rest of his natural life trapped inside the consequences of his own horrific sin. The long-buried evidence had spoken. The killer's fate was sealed. Justice had finally prevailed. The harsh glare of the fluorescent lights inside the GBI Forensic Archival Laboratory illuminated an ocean of steel shelving units stretching into the shadowed depths of the facility's climate-controlled basement. Thousands of cardboard containers, each marked with yellow biohazard tape and black permanent marker, stood lined up like silent headstones. These were the unsolved records of George's past, cases where the leads had run dry, the witnesses had vanished or died, and the blood, hair, and clothing left behind had spent decades waiting for technology to catch up with human malice. Following the landmark conviction of Arthur Pendleton, the momentum generated by the Elena Vance cold case initiative transformed Detective Marcus Thorne's unit into a regional nerve center. The Fulton County Task Force was no longer merely re-examining localized dossiers. They had created a systematic blueprint for unlocking long-buried secrets across the state. But as the ink dried on the new state legislation, a fresh and terrifying reality began to emerge from the darkness of the state's forensic vault. While analyzing the logistical records seized from Arthur Pendleton's Alpharetta residence, specifically a collection of hand-drawn maps, forgotten work logs, and personal pocket calendars dating from 1982 to 1989, Detective Sarah Miller stumbled upon a series of cryptic, highly detailed entries that made her blood run cold. In the margins of Pendleton's 1984 logistics calendar, written in faded blue ballpoint pen, were precise geographic coordinates, military-style grid references, and singular, isolated letters paired with dates: ML, April 12, 84, CR, September 28, 85, and KT, November 3, 86. Miller called Thorne over to her desk in the quiet, dim glow of the precinct's late-night shift. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice tight with tension as she pointed at the frayed leather-bound planner resting under a desk lamp. "We thought Elena Vance was an isolated crime of opportunity born from a sick obsession. Look at these entries. The delivery routes. The dates. The initials." Thorne leaned over the desk, magnifying glass in hand, scanning the faded ink. His breath hitched in his throat. The dates didn't just align with Pendleton's employment at Southeastern Medical Logistics. They directly corresponded to 3 separate, high-profile cold case missing persons reports filed across northern Georgia during the mid-1980s, cases that had baffled regional authorities for over 40 years and had long been presumed dead ends. The narrative surrounding Arthur Pendleton was shifting rapidly, turning from the story of a single, desperate murder into the nightmare scenario every law enforcement officer dreads: the unmasking of a calculated, methodical, and undetected serial predator who had used his mundane job as a medical delivery driver to stalk, abduct, and conceal his victims across the rural stretches of the state. The first entry, ML, April 12, 84, linked directly to the disappearance of Margaret Lawson, a 19-year-old receptionist at a dental clinic in Marietta who had vanished without a trace after leaving her office on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Her car had been found abandoned near an interstate off-ramp, empty and wiped clean of fingerprints. The second entry, CR, September 28, 85, pointed to Clara Reynolds, a 21-year-old lab technician from Athens whose mysterious disappearance had sparked massive searches through the surrounding national forests, yielding 0 physical evidence, 0 leads, and 40 years of agony for her surviving parents. The third entry, KT, November 3, 86, matched the file of Catherine Tate, a 23-year-old home health nurse whose vanishing from a rural highway near Macon had led to endless rumors, dead-end interrogations, and eventual silence. "He didn't stop with Elena," Thorne muttered, staring at the planner as the realization settled like a physical weight in the room. Elena wasn't his first victim. She was just the one he panicked over because he left her body inside the city limits in a house tied to his delivery network. The task force immediately mobilized in total secrecy. To avoid triggering a media circus that could compromise the fragile, emerging investigation, Thorne and Miller arranged an unannounced, off-the-record visit to the maximum security facility in Reedsville. 2 days later, inside a heavily guarded, windowless interrogation room deep within the interior of Georgia State Prison, Arthur Pendleton was brought out in heavy chains. The orange jumpsuit hung loosely off his frail frame. The 2 months he had spent behind bars had aged him drastically. His cheeks were sunken, his gait was hesitant, and his eyes lacked the calm, unassuming demeanor he had maintained during his decades in suburban Alpharetta. Thorne didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid 3 color photographs across the metal table. Old driver's license photos of Margaret Lawson, Clara Reynolds, and Catherine Tate, alongside high-resolution copies of the entries from his 1980s pocket planners. Pendleton glanced down at the photos, then immediately closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the concrete wall. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips. "You thought we were done, Arthur," Thorne said, his voice low, steady, and cut with absolute authority. "You thought that by pleading guilty to Elena Vance, you had bought your peace. You thought you could take the rest of your trophies to the grave." Pendleton's hands, bound at the wrists by heavy steel cuffs attached to a waist chain, trembled violently against the cold metal tabletop. "I gave you what you wanted," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "I gave you Elena. I gave her sister peace. Why can't you just leave it alone?" "Because Margaret, Clara, and Catherine don't have peace," Detective Miller interjected, leaning forward, her eyes locked onto Pendleton's pale face. "Their mothers died wondering where their daughters were buried. Their brothers and sisters are still waiting for a phone call. You built a life out of lies, Arthur, but the science caught you once, and the paper trail you kept in your own handwriting is going to catch you again. You have one chance to do something right before your time runs out." For nearly 45 minutes, Pendleton resisted, shaking his head, whimpering, and pleading for the detectives to leave. But Thorne knew the psychological cracks in a man who had lived behind a wall of secrets. Pendleton wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a cowardly narcissist who meticulously documented his crimes because he couldn't bear the thought of his dark legacy disappearing entirely. The pocket planners weren't just calendars. They were his secret trophies, his private record of control. Finally, Pendleton broke. Tears welled up in his milky eyes as he dropped his head onto his chest. "I didn't want to hurt them," Pendleton sobbed, his confession tumbling out in a raspy, fragmented stream. "It was like an infection in my head. I'd drive those long delivery routes at night. Empty roads, dark highways. I'd see them working late, walking to their cars, vulnerable. And the darkness would take over. After it happened, I couldn't keep them near the city. The cellar on Oakwood was a mistake, a panic. The others, I took them out where nobody looks, where the woods are thick." Over the course of a harrowing 6-hour session, Pendleton provided detailed descriptions of rural properties, old logging roads, and abandoned gravel quarries across 3 North Georgia counties where he had buried his victims between 1984 and 1986. Equipped with Pendleton's handwritten coordinates, historic land survey records from the 1980s, and state-of-the-art ground-penetrating radar, GPR, units, Thorne led a joint task force consisting of GBI forensic anthropologists, cadaver dog units, and state troopers into the dense, pine-choked wilderness outside of Lumpkin County. The search operations were grueling and intense. For days, the teams battled cold winter rains, thick underbrush, and decades of soil erosion. The landscape had changed drastically over 40 years. Old dirt roads had been swallowed by forestry growth, timber companies had cleared sections of land, and property lines had shifted. Yet, on the 4th day of excavation near a long-abandoned granite quarry 6 miles off a quiet state route, a specialized cadaver search K-9 alerted near the base of an overgrown white oak tree. Forensic anthropologists carefully scraped back layers of pine needles, leaves, and topsoil. 18 inches below the surface, beneath the root systems of the mature tree, Excavators uncovered physical remnants buried deep in the Georgia clay, a faded leather purse, silver jewelry, and human skeletal remains. Within 72 hours, emergency DNA extraction conducted at the state crime lab confirmed the identity. The remains belonged to Margaret Lawson, who had vanished from Marietta 42 years prior. Subsequent excavations conducted over the following 2 weeks at 2 additional sites identified by Pendleton yielded the remains of Clara Reynolds and Catherine Tate. The horrific 40-year mystery that had haunted 3 separate families across northern Georgia was brought to a decisive, unyielding end. The news broke across national networks with explosive force. The headline-dominated primetime broadcasts, Georgia Cold Case Task Force uncovers 1980s serial killer. 3 more victims exhumed following conviction of Arthur Pendleton. The public reaction was a mixture of absolute horror and profound relief. The quiet suburban deacon who had been arrested for a single cold case murder in late 2025 was officially revealed to be one of the most prolific, undetected serial predators in Georgia's history. In Savannah, Clara Vance stood side by side with the surviving family members of Margaret Lawson, Clara Reynolds, and Catherine Tate during a joint press conference on the steps of the state capitol. Where there had once been isolated grief, there was now a unified front of surviving families bound together by tragedy, closure, and the relentless march of justice. For decades, we were isolated islands of sorrow, said Thomas Lawson, the 60-year-old brother of Margaret Lawson, his voice choked with emotion as he held a portrait of his sister. We thought our loved ones were forgotten dust in an archive drawer. But Detective Thorne, Detective Miller, and the incredible scientists at the GBI proved that time does not erase love, and it certainly does not protect a murderer from the truth. Back in the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, prosecutors formally filed 3 additional counts of malice murder against Arthur Pendleton. To avoid the prolonged agony of multiple trials for the surviving families, Pendleton signed an absolute, unappealable global plea agreement, accepting 3 additional consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, waiving all rights to future legal appeals or state clemency. The legal saga of Arthur Pendleton was irrevocably closed. He was returned to his cell at Georgia State Prison, destined to spend every remaining day of his natural life isolated from the world he had terrorized in secret. In the spring of 2026, the Fulton County Precinct officially inaugurated the Elena Vance Memorial Forensic Center, a state-of-the-art regional laboratory dedicated exclusively to the application of advanced genetic genealogy, high-sensitivity DNA recovery, and digital cold case archaeology. On the wall of the main lobby hung 4 polished brass plaques, each bearing a name, a photograph, and a date: Elena Vance, Margaret Lawson, Clara Reynolds, and Catherine Tate. Beneath their names, engraved deep into the metal, were the words, "Never forgotten, never buried." Detective Marcus Thorne stood in the quiet lobby on the morning of the building's dedication, looking up at the plaques as the morning sun cast long streaks of gold across the marble floor. In his hand, he held his final administrative file, a single, thin folder containing the completed closure reports for all 4 cases. He walked over to the central archive vault, placed the folder into the high-security cabinet, and turned the heavy lock until it clicked into place. The journey that had begun with a trembling midnight phone call from a payphone on Ponce de Leon Avenue in August 1987 had finally reached its ultimate conclusion. The rain on Oakwood Street had long since dried, the old Victorian house had been torn down, and the damp cellar had been cleared away. But the lesson forged in the fire of those 4-decade-old investigations remained forever etched in the history of law enforcement. No matter how deep a crime is buried, no matter how clever the killer believes himself to be, and no matter how many decades pass in silent obscurity, the truth is an unyielding force. It waits in the microscopic fibers of an old rope, in the pages of an old ledger, and in the hearts of those who refuse to give up hope, ready to strip away the mask of innocence and deliver justice to the dark. The summer sun of June 2026 beat down relentlessly on the asphalt of downtown Atlanta, casting stark shadows across the modern glass facade of the newly dedicated Elena Vance Memorial Forensic Center. Inside, the climate-controlled rooms hummed with the quiet, rhythmic whir of supercomputers, mass spectrometers, and high-throughput DNA sequencers. The atmosphere was sterile, precise, and uncompromising. Here, the past did not remain a vague memory. It was dismantled, element by element, until every hidden truth was forced into the light. In his second-floor corner office, Detective Marcus Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, looking out over the city skyline. His desk, once burdened with the faded yellow folders of the Oakwood Street murder and its horrific spin-offs, was now lined with fresh, neatly bound binders sent from precincts across the American South. The unmasking of Arthur Pendleton had not just closed 4 cold cases. It had cracked open a Pandora's box of historical criminal files that had sat untouched for generations. A soft knock at the heavy oak door broke his concentration. Detective Sarah Miller stepped inside, carrying a thick black leather-bound binder stamped with a red seal from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "We have a problem, Marcus," Miller said, her tone devoid of its usual sharp confidence. She placed the binder gently onto the desk between them. "Or rather, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has a problem, and they're asking us to help them fix it." Thorne pulled the binder toward him, opening the cover to reveal a series of color-coded maps, timeline charts, and high-resolution black-and-white crime scene photos dating back to the late 1970s. "What am I looking at, Sarah?" When Pendleton signed his global plea agreement for the murders of Elena Vance, Margaret Lawson, Clara Reynolds, and Catherine Tate, everyone in law enforcement assumed we had drawn the final boundary around his reign of terror, Miller explained, pointing to a series of red pins scattered across a map of the southeastern United States. The BU spent the last 3 months cross-referencing Pendleton's complete employment records, not just his tenure at Southeastern Medical Logistics, but his early career in the late 1970s, when he worked as an interstate long-haul courier for a regional pharmaceutical distributor based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. Thorne felt a familiar, cold, sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. His delivery routes weren't limited to Georgia. "Not even close," Miller replied, turning the page to reveal a series of missing persons flyers from North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and Eastern Tennessee between 1976 and 1981. 7 young women. All of them vanished from gas stations, roadside diners, or late-night medical clinics located within 2 miles of interstate exit ramps along Pendleton's documented long-haul shipping routes. No bodies were ever recovered. No physical evidence was tied to a suspect at the time. The files have been sitting in federal archives for nearly 50 years. The implications were staggering. The quiet deacon from Alpharetta, who had spent decades masquerading as an ordinary suburban neighbor, was potentially not just a regional predator, but one of the most expansive, unmonitored serial killers in mid-century American history. Does Pendleton know the FBI is looking into his early years? Thorne asked, his eyes scanning the names and dates on the missing persons posters. "Not yet," Miller said. "The BU tried to interview him at Reedsville last week, but the second they mentioned Charlotte and 1978, Pendleton shut down. He refused to speak, invoked his plea agreement terms, and turned his back on the agents. He knows we can't threaten him with a death penalty because of his signed deal on the Georgia cases. He thinks he's bulletproof behind those prison walls." Thorne closed the binder with a heavy thud. He knew the psychology of Arthur Pendleton better than anyone alive. Pendleton was a man obsessed with control. He had surrendered his secrets about Elena Vance, Margaret Lawson, Clara Reynolds, and Catherine Tate only when cornered by irrefutable, scientific certainty, when faced with his own physical footprint preserved in the nylon rope fibers and the Georgia clay. To break his silence on these new, cold case disappearances, Thorne wouldn't need aggressive interrogations or federal threats. He needed physical, microscopic proof from the past. Within 48 hours, Thorne and Miller were on a military transport flight heading toward the FBI's evidence storage facility in Quantico, Virginia. Deep within the federal vault lay evidence container NC 78-0119. The preserved physical items recovered from an abandoned station wagon found on a shoulder of Interstate 85 outside of Greensboro, North Carolina, on a chilly November night in 1978. The car had belonged to Sandra Linwood, a 20-year-old pharmacy technician who had vanished while driving home from her evening shift. The original 1978 investigation had yielded 0 fingerprints, no forced entry signs, and no blood. The car had sat in a state impound lot before its contents were cataloged, boxed, and transferred to federal storage, where they had collected dust for 48 years. Inside the Quantico cleanroom, wearing full biohazard gear, Thorne and a team of senior federal forensic geneticists opened the sealed container. Inside were Sandra Linwood's personal items, her vinyl purse, a half-empty packet of gum, an umbrella, and the driver's side floor mat, which had been preserved in an airtight plastic bag. The original technicians in 1978 dusted the steering wheel and handles for latent prints, which yielded nothing because the killer wore gloves, explained Dr. Evelyn Vance Cross, the chief genetic analyst at the Quantico lab. But they didn't think about contact transfer on the interior rubber surfaces. When a driver forces a victim into a vehicle or steps heavily onto a floor mat during a struggle, microscopic skin cells, textile fibers, and soil particles get crushed into the rubber grooves. Using high-intensity forensic light sources and vacuum-assisted cellular collection techniques developed specifically for ancient or degraded samples, technicians swept the rubber grooves of the driver's side floor mat. The collected microscopic material was put through an advanced ultra-deep DNA sequencing process, a technique capable of reconstructing full genetic profiles from as few as 3 or 4 degraded human skin cells. For 6 agonizing days, the lab worked in total isolation while Thorne waited in a nearby hotel, reviewing the cold case files of the 7 missing women from the late 1970s. On the 7th morning, the call came through. "Marcus, you need to come to the lab immediately," Dr. Vance Cross said over the secure line. "We didn't just find skin cells. We found something far more definitive." When Thorne arrived at the Quantico facility, Dr. Vance Cross pulled up a high-definition digital render on a massive display monitor. The screen showed a microscopic, multi-layered chemical analysis of a tiny, crushed residue particle extracted from the deep heel groove of the driver's side floor mat. "It's not just human DNA," Dr. Vance Cross explained, pointing to the spectral analysis graph on the screen. "It's a compound mixture. We found trace amounts of a specialized, industrial grease used exclusively in the wheel bearings of heavy-duty commercial transport trucks manufactured between 1975 and 1980. Mixed directly into that grease matrix were skin cells containing a full, pristine male DNA profile." She tapped a key on her keyboard, bringing up a side-by-side comparison chart. "We ran the profile against the state database sample we took from Arthur Pendleton during his arrest in Alpharetta. It's an absolute 100% match. Arthur Pendleton was inside Sandra Linwood's vehicle on the night she vanished in November 1978. Equipped with the new, irrefutable federal evidence, Thorne and Miller returned to Georgia. This time, they didn't go to the prison interrogation room in Reedsville alone. They were accompanied by a senior federal prosecutor and a video recording team from the United States Department of Justice. When Arthur Pendleton was led into the room, he looked older, weaker, and more withdrawn than he had 3 months prior. He sat down heavily in the steel chair, staring at the table, refusing to acknowledge the presence of the investigators. "I have nothing to say to you," Pendleton muttered, his voice coarse and hollow. "My deal is signed. I'm dying in this place anyway. You can't touch me." Thorne didn't argue. He slowly laid out a single, large digital photograph on the table. It was the microscopic render of the truck grease and skin cell matrix recovered from Sandra Linwood's car, overlaid with his official 1978 interstate delivery route manifest from Charlotte to Greensboro. "We don't need you to talk to us to prove you were there, Arthur," Thorne said quietly, his voice echoing in the small room. "This is Sandra Linwood's car. November 14th, 1978. Modern science found your footprint crushed into the floor mat of her station wagon 48 years after you thought you wiped it clean. The federal government has officially indicted you on 7 counts of capital kidnapping resulting in death across 3 states." Pendleton's eyes widened as he stared at the image. His breath caught in his throat, and his pale, spotted hands began to tremble against the steel handcuffs. The illusion of his absolute control, the quiet satisfaction he had held onto, believing he had outsmarted the federal authorities regarding his early crimes, shattered instantly.
How?
How could you find that? Pendleton whispered, his voice cracking with genuine terror. It was almost 50 years ago. The car was clean. I wiped everything. You wiped what you could see, Arthur, Miller said, leaning forward. But you can't hide from the microscopic world. Science remembers every place you walked, every item you touched, and every victim you took. You can sit in this room and stay silent, or you can tell us where Sandra and the others are buried so their families can bring them home before you die in a federal cell. The weight of the unyielding scientific proof, combined with the realization that his dark legacy was completely exposed down to its very origins, finally crushed the last remnants of Pendleton's resistance. The old man slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cold metal tabletop, weeping uncontrollably. Over the next 12 hours, in a sweeping, historic recorded deposition, Arthur Pendleton provided full, detailed confessions regarding all 7 missing women from his early long-haul courier days between 1976 and 1981. He drew detailed maps pinpointing forgotten drainage basins, rural bridge abutments, and deserted overgrown properties along the interstate corridors of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. The massive, multi-state recovery operation that followed in the late summer of 2026 was the largest coordinated forensic exhumation in the history of the southeastern United States. Using Pendleton's detailed maps, ground-penetrating radar, and forensic archaeology teams from 5 universities, law enforcement agencies systematically recovered the remains of all 7 victims, bringing an absolute, definitive resolution to cases that had stood as painful, unsolved wounds for nearly half a century. The news shocked the entire nation. Headlines across major international news networks proclaimed the historic resolution. 50-year cold case, mystery solved. Scientific breakthrough unmasks mid-century interstate serial killer. On a clear, warm afternoon in late July 2026, a solemn memorial service was held at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Washington, D.C. The surviving family members of all 11 known victims of Arthur Pendleton, from the young nurse Elena Vance in Atlanta to Sandra Linwood in North Carolina, gathered together in a unified, powerful display of memory, resilience, and closure. Clara Vance stood at the podium, looking out at the hundreds of family members, law enforcement officers, and scientists assembled in the auditorium. Beside her stood Detective Marcus Thorne and Detective Sarah Miller. For nearly 50 years, a dark shadow walked among us, taking our sisters, our daughters, and our friends, hiding behind the mask of an ordinary man and the slow passage of time, Clara said, her voice resonant and clear. He believed that because decades had passed, his crimes had faded into dust. But he underestimated the power of truth. He underestimated the dedication of officers who refused to give up, and the miraculous light of modern science that can read the quietest whisper left behind on an old piece of rope or a dusty floor mat. She looked directly at Thorne and Miller, her eyes filled with tears of profound gratitude. Today, 11 families finally have their loved ones back. 11 names are restored to the light. The killer thought he had buried his past forever, but the evidence spoke from the dark, and justice reached across half a century to seal his fate. Back at the Fulton County Precinct in Atlanta, the atmosphere was quiet as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long orange rays across the desk where the journey had begun months earlier. On the wall of the cold case unit, the massive board that had once contained dozens of red pins representing unsolved cases from the 1970s and 1980s was now almost entirely clean. Detective Marcus Thorne picked up his coat, looked back at the framed photograph of Elena Vance resting on his desk, and turned off the office lights. The long journey through the dark corridors of the past was complete. The rain on Oakwood Street, the damp cellar in Atlanta, the remote pine forests of North Georgia, and the dusty highways of the Carolinas were no longer haunts of unanswered horror. The long-buried evidence had fulfilled its ultimate purpose, demonstrating to the world that no matter how much time elapses, no matter how cold the trail becomes, and no matter how deep the secret is hidden, justice never sleeps, never forgets, and will always find its way home. Part 6, Word Count, 2,630 words. The scorching heat of August 2026 hung heavy over the concrete courtyard of the maximum security federal penitentiary in Florence, Colorado. Arthur Pendleton had been transferred from Georgia state custody into the absolute isolation of the federal system following his global indictment and conviction for the multi-state interstate homicides. Stripped of his name, his possessions, and his former illusion of suburban respectability, inmate 00094821 spent 23 hours a day inside a cell designed to neutralize every human contact. The world outside had moved on, but inside his mind, the past refused to stay dormant. At the Elena Vance Memorial Forensic Center in Atlanta, the atmosphere was charged with a different kind of intensity. The resolution of 11 homicides across 5 states had established the center as a global benchmark for cold case investigations. Yet, for Detective Marcus Thorne and Detective Sarah Miller, the ultimate lesson of the Pendleton investigation was not victory, but vigilance. They knew that the microscopic methods that had brought down a decades-old serial predator were not unique to a single killer. They were keys capable of unlocking hundreds of cold files gathering dust in vaults across the Deep South. It was late on a Thursday evening when a wooden crate arrived at the precinct's secure loading dock, dispatched directly from the parish sheriff's office in Ouachita, Louisiana. The crate contained the untouched physical evidence of a 1982 double homicide that had haunted the Bayou country for 44 years. The unsolved murders of young newlyweds David and Clara Brooks, who had vanished while camping near the Black Bayou Lake National Wildlife Refuge. The original investigation in 1982 had hit a brick wall almost immediately. The couple's abandoned camper van had been found burnt to a shell on a secluded dirt access road. Local authorities at the time had assumed the fire was intended to destroy all physical proof. No bodies were recovered for months until a drought lowered the water levels of the bayou, revealing the rusted remains of a metal tool chest submerged in 16 feet of murky water. Inside were the skeletal remains of David and Clara Brooks, bound with heavy steel baling wire. For over 4 decades, the case had been classified as an unsolved robbery homicide carried out by unknown local drifters. However, when the Louisiana State Police reviewed the forensic breakthroughs accomplished by Thorne's task force in Atlanta, they noticed a disturbing parallel in the physical evidence. The precise, complex, professional knots used to secure the steel baling wire around the victim's wrists mirrored the intricate industrial hitches Pendleton had used on his victims in Georgia and the Carolinas. Miller brought the newly cataloged Louisiana file into Thorne's office, spreading the monochrome 1982 crime scene photographs across his desk. "Look at the wire ties, Marcus," she pointed out, her finger tracing the rusted strands in the photo. "This isn't random. It's a double-loop hitch with an inverted lock, the exact same technique found on the nylon ropes bound around Elena Vance and the tarpaulins in the North Georgia quarries." Thorne leaned over the photographs, scrutinizing the mechanical precision of the wire wraps. Pendleton was working as a regional delivery driver in 1982, but his routes were supposed to be strictly confined to the eastern seaboard. Louisiana wasn't on his corporate logs. "Not on his primary logs," Miller corrected, sliding a freshly subpoenaed archive document from a defunct freight company across the table. In the spring of 1982, Southeastern Logistics temporarily subcontracted 6 of its drivers to an agricultural supply corridor running between Birmingham, Montgomery, and Monroe, Louisiana. Pendleton was on that route for 6 weeks in April and May of 1982, the exact timeframe David and Clara Brooks vanished. The realization hit the room like a cold blast of air. The scope of Pendleton's dark journey was expanding once again into regions where local authorities had long given up hope of ever finding answers. The task force wasted no time. Under strict chain of custody protocols, the original rusted baling wire recovered from the Louisiana Bayou chest was delivered to the center's Advanced Metallurgy and Microtrace Extraction Laboratory. The challenge was formidable. Unlike nylon rope or soft cotton fibers, smooth metal baling wire exposed to 44 years of submersion in stagnant, acidic bayou water was considered by traditional forensic standards to be entirely stripped of biological material. However, Dr. Vance Cross and her team at the center had developed a revolutionary technique called cavitation microextraction, using targeted ultrasonic sound waves suspended in a specialized liquid buffer solution to dislodge microscopic cellular fragments trapped deep inside the microscopic rust pits and corrosion grooves of the metal wire. For 3 days, the laboratory performed continuous ultrasonic cycles on the rusted wire segments. The process was painstaking, requiring absolute precision to avoid destroying the degraded cellular walls. On the 3rd night, the automated sequencing array flagged a positive hit. The ultrasonic extraction had successfully freed 48 degraded human skin cells that had been crushed into the microscopic rust crevices beneath the twisted wire knots before the chest was submerged. The cells had been sealed off from oxygen and aquatic bacteria by a layer of hardened industrial grease that had coated the baling wire prior to the crime. Dr. Vance Cross initiated the genetic sequencing. By midnight, the computer rendered a complete short tandem repeat, STR, profile. The profile was cross-referenced directly against the Federal Master Database profile of Arthur Pendleton. The monitor flashed bright green. Match confirmed. Probability of individual random selection, 1 in 14 trillion. The scientific proof was absolute. Arthur Pendleton had been in Louisiana in May 1982, and his hands had twisted the baling wire that sealed the fate of David and Clara Brooks. Armed with the new genetic match, Thorne and Miller flew to the Federal Correctional Complex in Florence, Colorado. They were escorted through 4 security checkpoints into the high-security interview room, where Pendleton sat behind a thick panel of reinforced bulletproof glass, speaking through a heavy iron grate. The old man looked entirely defeated. The arrogance that had once defined his secret double life was completely gone, replaced by the hollow posture of a man who realized that no corner of the earth, no passage of time, and no depth of water could hide his sins from the reach of modern science. Thorne picked up the intercom receiver and held a single photograph against the glass, the rusted metal tool chest retrieved from the Louisiana Bayou in 1982. Louisiana, Arthur, Thorne said, his voice ringing crisp through the speaker. May 14th, 1982. Black Bayou Lake. David and Clara Brooks. Pendleton's eyes shifted slowly to the photograph. A long, trembling breath escaped his lips, rattling in his chest. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to make excuses. He slowly closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the cold glass panel. The water. Pendleton whispered, his voice weak and metallic through the intercom. I threw it in 16 feet of mud. I thought the water would wash it all away. I thought the mud would eat everything. Water doesn't wash away the truth anymore, Arthur, Miller said into a receiver. The rust preserved your touch. Your skin cells were trapped under the grease in that wire for 44 years, waiting for us to pull them out. Pendleton began to weep, not tears of repentance for the young couple whose lives he had brutally cut short, but the bitter, pathetic tears of a predator whose ultimate nightmare was the complete, undeniable exposure of his total legacy of evil. Over the next 4 hours, with federal prosecutors and Louisiana state investigators listening via video uplink, Arthur Pendleton provided a full, detailed confession regarding the murders of David and Clara Brooks, describing the robbery, the abduction, and the disposal of the chest in the bayou. He signed his formal confession, waiving all rights to extradition or trial, sealing his 5th consecutive life sentence without the possibility of parole. The news of the Louisiana breakthrough sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community nationwide. Headlines across international media organizations declared, Bayou cold case solved after 44 years. Modern forensics links incarcerated serial killer to 1982 double homicide. For the surviving family members of David and Clara Brooks, including Clara's 84-year-old mother, who had spent over 4 decades lighting a sanctuary candle in her local church every Sunday, the news brought an overwhelming wave of emotional healing and long overdue peace. In a tearful public statement broadcast live from Monroe, Louisiana, Clara's mother held up a photograph of her daughter and son-in-law on their wedding day. For 44 years, I prayed that before I closed my eyes for the last time, I would know who took my children, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I thought my prayers were lost in the dark. But God gave wisdom to those scientists and strength to those detectives. Today, my children can finally rest in peace, and the man who did this can never hurt another soul." Back in Atlanta, the success of the Brooks case marked a monumental turning point for the Elena Vance Memorial Forensic Center. The facility was officially awarded a federal grant to establish the National Aquatic Cold Case Task Force, a specialized unit dedicated exclusively to applying cavitation extraction and advanced DNA recovery to submerged physical evidence from unsolved homicides across the United States. On a crisp autumn morning in late October 2026, Detective Marcus Thorne and Detective Sarah Miller stood on the granite steps of the Fulton County Courthouse. The air was cool, and the bright morning sun reflected off the glass towers of downtown Atlanta. Thorne carried a heavy leather briefcase containing the finalized, closed case files of 12 victims whose deaths had been brought to justice through their unit's unyielding determination over the past year. He walked into the central archival room, opened the master vault, and placed the files onto the permanent shelf alongside Box 87 to 4092, the original case file of Elena Vance. He paused for a moment, resting his hand on the metal drawer, reflecting on the long, dark journey that had begun with a cold grave in a damp Victorian cellar on Oakwood Street in August 1987. The mystery that had once seemed unsolvable, frozen in time and shrouded in decades of silence, had been completely shattered. Science had bridged the chasm between past and present. The long-buried evidence had spoken across the span of nearly half a century, stripping away the monster's mask, delivering closure to grieving families across the nation, and proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that justice is an eternal, unyielding light that no darkness can ever extinguish. The harsh morning light of November 2026 filtered through the frosted glass windows of the cold case archival wing at the Elena Vance Memorial Forensic Center in Atlanta. Outside, late autumn leaves drifted across Ponce de Leon Avenue, but inside the secure facility, time was measured not by seasons, but by the steady, unyielding recovery of forgotten lives. What had begun as an isolated investigation into a single 1987 murder in a damp Victorian basement had evolved into an unprecedented, multi-jurisdictional forensic crusade spanning over 5 decades of American history. For Detective Marcus Thorne and Detective Sarah Miller, the closing of the Louisiana Bayou file had brought a brief, solemn moment of reflection. Yet, the relentless nature of historical homicide work offered little room for lingering. In the wake of Arthur Pendleton's sweeping confessions, federal agencies, state bureaus, and rural county sheriff departments continued to cross-reference his past employment routes with unsolved disappearances from the mid-1970s through the late 1980s. It was during a routine audit of cold files from the Tennessee State Police that a brand new anomaly emerged, one that threatened to push the boundaries of their understanding even further. Detective Miller stood before the interactive digital evidence board in the center's main briefing room. Displayed on the screen was a yellowed, faded missing persons poster from Hamilton County, Tennessee, dated October 14, 1975. The poster bore the photograph of 18-year-old Evelyn Reed, a promising young musician who had vanished after leaving a late-night rehearsal at a community theater in Chattanooga. "Look at the timeline, Marcus," Miller said, tapping a stylus against the screen to bring up a split display. On the left side was Evelyn Reed's missing person report. On the right side was Arthur Pendleton's military discharge record from the United States Army Reserve, dated October 10, 1975, exactly 4 days before Evelyn disappeared. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the military documents. Pendleton was stationed at Fort Campbell along the Kentucky-Tennessee border before his discharge. "We always assumed his violent activity began when he took the commercial courier job in Charlotte in 1976. That's what he wanted us to believe," Miller replied, her voice grim. "He wanted us to think his dark impulses started in his mid-20s with his delivery trucks. But if he killed Evelyn Reed in Chattanooga in October 1975, it means his predatory escalation didn't begin on the open highways. It began while he was still wearing a military uniform." The revelation carried chilling implications. If Pendleton had committed a murder prior to his civilian career, the established psychological profile constructed by federal behavioral analysts was fundamentally incomplete. The task force was no longer looking at a killer who had gradually fallen into darkness through the isolation of long-haul driving. They were looking at a predator whose deadly instincts were already fully formed before he ever stepped foot into a commercial delivery van. Thorne immediately contacted the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office in Tennessee, requesting the immediate transfer of all surviving evidence tied to the 1975 disappearance of Evelyn Reed. 24 hours later, a secure transport vehicle delivered evidence box TN 75-0882 to the Atlanta Center. The box was small, worn, and smelled faintly of old cardboard and machine oil. Inside were the meager physical remnants recovered from the original 1975 investigation: Evelyn Reed's abandoned acoustic guitar case, found on a dirt shoulder off Highway 27, and a pair of tarnished brass spectacles recovered 3 miles away in a drainage ditch. Crucially, the box also contained something the original investigators in 1975 had failed to understand: a short length of heavy-duty olive-drab canvas webbing strap, commonly used in military utility duffel bags during the Vietnam War era. The strap had been found snagged on a barbed wire fence near the drainage ditch, where Evelyn's glasses were discovered. In 1975, investigators had dismissed the canvas strap as random roadside litter left behind by agricultural workers or passing army convoys. In the cleanroom of the Vance Forensic Center, Dr. Evelyn Vance Cross and her team prepared the canvas webbing for ultratrace analysis. Unlike smooth metals or modern synthetic polymers, vintage woven canvas present unique scientific challenges. Over 51 years, the coarse cotton nylon weave of the military strap had absorbed road dust, environmental oil, and moisture. Yet, the deep internal weave of high-density canvas had a unique property. It acted as a protective cocoon for microscopic organic material trapped within the tight cross-stitched fibers. Using high-resolution infrared thermal imaging combined with non-destructive liquid nitrogen solvation, technicians gently separated the microfibers of the canvas strap. Deep inside the innermost core of the stitched webbing, where sunlight and oxygen could not penetrate, they uncovered microscopic traces of desiccated human biological material, specifically microscopic skin flakes and hair follicles without root tissue. In 1975, this strap was pulled with immense force, Dr. Vance Cross explained to Thorne and Miller as they watched the procedure through the laboratory observation window. The friction of the webbing being cinched tight transferred epidermal cells deep into the mechanical weave of the canvas. The natural oils in the military-grade cotton sealed those cells against atmospheric decay for more than 5 decades. The laboratory team utilized ultra-deep single-cell genomic sequencing to reconstruct a viable genetic profile from the trapped skin flakes. For 4 agonizing days, the high-throughput sequencers processed the degraded DNA fragments, piecing together the microscopic puzzle base pair by base pair. On the 5th morning, the computer system completed the alignment algorithm. The resulting full STR DNA profile was immediately uploaded to the federal database for direct comparison against Arthur Pendleton's reference sample. The system alert chimed across the laboratory workstation. Positive match confirmed. Specific individual DNA identification. Arthur Pendleton, October 1975 canvas strap sample. The scientific proof was absolute and indisputable. Arthur Pendleton had held that military canvas strap in his hands off Highway 27 in Chattanooga on the night Evelyn Reed vanished in October 1975. Armed with this groundbreaking 51-year-old genetic match, Detective Thorne and Detective Miller boarded a flight to the federal maximum security facility in Florence, Colorado. The physical condition of Arthur Pendleton had deteriorated significantly since his transfer to the high-security federal block. His hair was stark white, his posture severely stooped, and his eyes carried the hollow, vacant look of a man who spent 23 hours a day staring at concrete walls. He was brought into the glass partition visitation booth in heavy restraints, looking at Thorne with a mixture of resentment and profound, weary resignation. Thorne didn't offer a greeting. He simply pressed a single photograph against the glass, an old, black and white high school yearbook photo of Evelyn Reed holding her acoustic guitar in the autumn of 1974. Beside it, he placed a copy of Pendleton's 1975 military discharge papers from Fort Campbell. "Chattanooga, Arthur," Thorne said, his voice quiet, clear, and unyielding through the intercom. "October 14th, 1975. You were 24 years old. You were wearing an Army uniform. You thought 5 decades had wiped that highway clean." Pendleton stared at the black and white photo of Evelyn Reed. His hands, bound at the wrists by heavy steel cuffs, began to shake violently against his lap. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the concrete wall behind him.
How?
"How could you possibly know about Chattanooga?" Pendleton rasped, his voice barely audible through the speaker. "There was nothing left on that road. I burned her things. I threw the guitar case away. I wiped everything." "You left your military duffel strap on the barbed wire fence, Arthur," Miller said, leaning close to the glass. "You pulled it tight, and your skin cells got locked inside the canvas fibers. They stayed there in an archive box in Tennessee for 51 years, waiting for modern science to bring your victim's name back into the light." A long, suffocating silence filled the booth. The hum of the prison's security ventilation system seemed to amplify the crushing weight of the moment. Pendleton's shoulders collapsed forward, and tears began to cut clean tracks through the dust on his wrinkled, sunken face. "I was young." Pendleton wept, his voice cracking with age and despair. "I was coming home from Fort Campbell. I saw her walking along the shoulder with that guitar. The darkness in my head. It took control of me long before I ever drove a delivery truck. I took her into the woods near the Tennessee River. Buried her near the old railway bridge, where no one ever goes." Over the next 5 hours, with Tennessee state prosecutors and federal agents listening via secure video uplink, Arthur Pendleton provided a full, minute-by-minute confession regarding the murder of Evelyn Reed in October 1975. He drew detailed topological sketches identifying the exact location near an abandoned railway trestle outside of Chattanooga, where he had buried her remains over half a century earlier. The subsequent exhumation operation conducted by the Tennessee State Police and forensic anthropologists from the University of Tennessee was executed with extreme care. Ground-penetrating radar units identified a disturbance beneath 6 feet of dense river silt near the old railway bridge. Within 48 hours, excavators successfully recovered the physical remains of Evelyn Reed, alongside a silver music note pendant she had worn on the night of her disappearance. The news of the 51-year-old breakthrough exploded across national and international news networks. Headlines dominated morning broadcasts across the country. 51-year-old cold case solved. Modern forensics unmasks serial killer's earliest known crime. The public reaction was one of monumental awe and solemn respect. The case stood as the oldest cold case murder ever successfully resolved through direct forensic DNA extraction from vintage canvas webbing in the history of global law enforcement. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, a special memorial service was held at the community theater where Evelyn Reed had played her last notes 51 years earlier. Her surviving younger brother, now a 72-year-old retired engineer, stood at the podium holding his sister's silver music note pendant, which had been restored by forensic technicians. "For more than half a century, my family lived in a cold, silent shadow," he said, his voice filled with deep emotion. "My parents died with broken hearts, believing that Evelyn had simply vanished into thin air, that her life didn't matter to the world. But today, because of the relentless dedication of Detective Thorne, Detective Miller, and the brilliant scientists in Atlanta, my sister's name is restored. Justice did not forget her. Science did not abandon her." Back at the Fulton County Precinct in Atlanta, Detective Marcus Thorne stood in the central archival vault of the Vance Memorial Forensic Center. He held the newly completed case file for Evelyn Reed, File TN 75-0882, now officially stamped with a bold red seal, case closed/conviction secured. He placed the file onto the permanent shelf beside the master containers of Elena Vance, Margaret Lawson, Clara Reynolds, Catherine Tate, Sandra Linwood, and David and Clara Brooks. 13 lives, stolen across 3 decades, brought out of the shadows and restored to the light through the unyielding power of modern science and human persistence. Thorne turned off the vault lights and stepped out into the hallway. The journey that had begun in a damp, decaying basement on Oakwood Street in August 1987 had redrawn the boundaries of criminal justice forever. It had proved that time is not a sanctuary for evil, that distance cannot protect a killer, and that no matter how deep a secret is buried under dirt, water, or decades of forgotten silence, the truth remains an eternal, unyielding flame that will always burn through the dark. The harsh winter winds of December 2026 whipped across the frost-covered granite steps of the Fulton County Justice Center in downtown Atlanta. Inside the heated auditorium of the Elena Vance Memorial Forensic Center, a solemn atmosphere prevailed. What had started 18 months earlier as an investigation into a single, localized 1987 cold case on Oakwood Street had escalated into the most expansive historical homicide investigation in the history of American law enforcement. Detective Marcus Thorne and Detective Sarah Miller sat in their second-floor office, surrounded by digital mapping monitors that displayed a complex network of interstate highways, delivery logistics hubs, and military deployment records stretching from 1974 to 1989. The total number of confirmed victims linked to Arthur Pendleton through direct, microscopic DNA matching had reached 13. The nation viewed the unit's work as a miraculous triumph of modern science. Yet, Thorne knew that in the world of serial predation, the discovery of one hidden truth often illuminated the edges of an even darker void. It was during a late-night audit of Pendleton's personal effects, specifically a crate of vintage automotive repair manuals and road atlases seized from his garage in Alpharetta, that Miller made a discovery that altered the trajectory of their investigation once again. While scanning the high-resolution digital X-ray imagery of a heavily worn 1979 Rand McNally Road Atlas, technicians noticed a physical anomaly. The heavy cardboard rear cover of the atlas was slightly thicker than standard factory specifications. Under precise thermal imaging and microscopic layer separation, forensic analysts discovered that the cover had been custom-modified with a hidden interior pocket, sealed carefully with rubber cement. Inside that hidden pocket lay 3 faded, monochrome 35mm photographic slides, wrapped in acid-free glassine paper, alongside a small, silver thumb latch key stamped with a 3-digit number, 402. Thorne and Miller examined the contents under the bright halogen lights of the laboratory cleanroom. The 3 35mm photographic slides did not depict landscapes or family gatherings. They showed a series of hand-drawn architectural floor plans, complete with precise dimensional measurements, structural cross-sections, and specific subterranean markings. The floor plans did not match the Victorian mansion on Oakwood Street where Elena Vance had been found. They depicted a completely different structure, a sprawling, multi-level agricultural storage facility with a subterranean root cellar, mapped with cold, draftsman-like precision. Written at the bottom of the second slide in Pendleton's unmistakable block lettering were 2 words, the repository. "This isn't a route map, Marcus," Miller whispered, her voice tight with tension as she adjusted the light table. "This is a blueprint." Pendleton didn't just bury his victims in random spots along highways or in vacant houses when he panicked. He built a centralized, subterranean site. The discovery of the key stamped 402 triggered an immediate federal database query across regional bank safety deposit boxes, storage locker facilities, and bus terminal lockers operating in Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee during the late 1970s and 1980s. Within 48 hours, the key was matched to a defunct industrial self-storage facility located in an industrial zone outside of Anniston, Alabama. The facility had been built in 1978 and had changed ownership 4 times over 40 years, but Unit 402 had remained legally frozen in administrative probate due to unpaid rental fees dating back to 1989, the exact year Pendleton had suddenly stopped his long-haul logistics work and settled into suburban domesticity in Alpharetta. A joint strike force consisting of Thorne's task force, the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, Alabama State Troopers, and Forensic Anthropology units mobilized immediately. On a cold, overcast Tuesday morning, The convoy arrived at the rusted corrugated steel gates of the Anniston storage facility. Unit 402 sat at the far rear of the property, tucked away in an isolated corner shaded by overgrown kudzu vines and pine trees. The exterior metal door was covered in decades of surface rust, its original padlock intact. Thorne stepped forward, inserted the silver thumb latch key into the lock, and turned it. The heavy internal tumbler clicked open with a sharp, metallic snap that echoed through the quiet industrial park. The heavy steel door was rolled upward, releasing a blast of cold, stagnant air that smelled of ozone, dry concrete, and ancient dust. The interior of the storage unit was lined with floor-to-ceiling steel shelving units, carefully arranged like an archive. But there were no household boxes or furniture inside. On the shelves stood 28 sealed steel military ammunition cans, each labeled with a Dymo-tape plastic label bearing a specific date, a town name, and a set of geographical coordinates spanning the years 1974 to 1988. At the rear of the storage unit, set into the concrete floor, was a heavy steel trapdoor secured with an industrial combination dial, the exact physical feature depicted on the hidden architectural slides found inside Pendleton's road atlas. "My God," Miller breathed, stepping back as tactical lights swept across the subterranean trapdoor. "It's a criminal archive." He built a permanent physical repository. The site was immediately designated a federal crime scene of maximum priority. Over the next 72 hours, a team of federal forensic specialists systematically documented, cataloged, and processed the contents of Unit 402 under strict chain of custody protocols. The steel ammunition cans did not contain human remains. They contained meticulously organized personal effects, identity cards, jewelry, clothing fragments, and handwritten journals detailing the abductions and locations of victims spanning 3 decades. The contents of the cans provided irrefutable physical proof linking Pendleton to cold case disappearances that had baffled law enforcement across 7 states for over 40 years. When the subterranean steel trapdoor was breached by federal engineers, investigators uncovered a reinforced concrete cellar equipped with specialized storage lockers, specialized tools, and a collection of pristine, unedited audio cassette tapes containing recorded logs made by Pendleton during his long-haul delivery trips between 1976 and 1988. In these audio recordings, speaking in a calm, monotonous, everyday voice, Pendleton recounted his movements, his psychological compulsions, and the precise geographic locations where he had concealed his victims across the southeastern United States. The tapes were a horrifying, minute-by-minute journal of a hidden double life, recorded by a man who believed his secrets would remain buried forever beneath concrete and steel. The discovery of Unit 402 fundamentally transformed the historical narrative of American serial crime. Pendleton was no longer merely a cold case killer exposed by modern DNA. He was unmasked as one of the most organized, methodical, and prolific serial predators in modern history, a man who had constructed a literal vault to house the evidence of his crimes while living an unassuming, respectable life as a suburban church deacon. Equipped with the mountains of physical evidence, journals, and audio cassette logs recovered from the Anniston repository, Detective Thorne and Detective Miller flew to the federal maximum security facility in Florence, Colorado, for what would be their final confrontation with Arthur Pendleton. The meeting took place inside the high-security legal conference room. Pendleton was brought in wearing heavy body restraints, supported by 2 federal guards. The old man was physically frail, his breathing labored, his eyes hollow and sunken. The news of the discovery of Unit 402 had reached him through his legal counsel 24 hours earlier, shattering the last remaining vestige of his psychological defense. Thorne placed a single audio recorder on the table between them and pressed play. The room filled with the sound of Pendleton's own young voice from a 1981 cassette tape, calmly describing his delivery route through South Carolina and the abduction of a young college student near Columbia. Pendleton stared at the tape recorder. A long, broken sob racked his thin frame, his head dropping onto his chest as he wept silently, his tears dripping onto his orange jumpsuit. "You built a repository, Arthur," Thorne said, his voice quiet, steady, and cut with absolute, unyielding authority. You thought that key hidden in your atlas would keep your secret safe forever. But time caught up with you. Science opened your lock, and every life you stole has been brought back into the light. I wanted to destroy them. Pendleton whimpered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. Every year, I'd tell myself to go to Anniston and burn it all. But I couldn't. It was my life. My real life. The house in Alpharetta, the church, the lawn. That was all just a mask. The repository was who I really was. And now the mask is gone, Arthur, Miller said, leaning forward. The whole world knows exactly who you are. There are no more secrets. No more hidden keys. No more dark cellars. Over the next 8 hours, facing the undeniable weight of the evidence recovered from Unit 402, Arthur Pendleton signed an absolute, comprehensive federal confession covering 27 individual homicides committed between 1974 and 1988 across 8 states. He provided full legal waivers, forfeiting every right to future appeals, post-conviction relief, or media access, accepting 27 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. 3 weeks later, on January 14, 2027, Arthur Pendleton died in his sleep inside his cell at the Federal Correctional Complex in Florence, Colorado, due to advanced cardiovascular disease at the age of 65. His death marked the absolute physical end of a monster whose hidden reign of terror had cast a dark shadow over the American South for nearly half a century. The news of Pendleton's death and the comprehensive resolution of 27 cold cases dominated international headlines. Front-page stories across the globe declared, "Final justice for the South's most prolific serial predator. 27 cold cases solved as historic investigation concludes." In Atlanta, a historic memorial service was held in the Grand Plaza outside the Fulton County Justice Center. Surviving family members from all 27 victims gathered together in an extraordinary display of unity, grief, and triumphant closure. Clara Vance stood alongside the brothers, sisters, children, and grandchildren of women who had vanished between 1974 and 1988. Together, they unveiled the newly expanded National Cold Case Memorial Wall, a massive monument of polished black granite bearing the 27 names of the women whose lives had been restored from the darkness of forgotten history. At the center of the granite wall, carved deep into the stone, were the words, "The evidence spoke. The darkness was vanquished. They are home." Detective Marcus Thorne and Detective Sarah Miller stood at the edge of the plaza, watching as family members placed flowers, candles, and photographs along the base of the black granite wall. Thorne pulled his coat tight against the cold winter wind, looking up at the clear, bright blue sky above Atlanta. The long, winding road that had begun with a single, trembling midnight phone call from a payphone on Ponce de Leon Avenue in August 1987 had finally reached its ultimate, unshakable end. The rain on Oakwood Street had cleared. The damp cellar had been turned to dust. The lock on Unit 402 had been shattered forever. The long-buried evidence had fulfilled its ultimate purpose, proving to the world for all time that no matter how deep a crime is hidden, no matter how clever the perpetrator believes himself to be, and no matter how many decades pass in silence, justice is an eternal, unyielding force that will always hunt down the dark and lead the innocent home. The icy dawn of February 2027 broke over the quiet grounds of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Decatur, casting a sharp blue light across the frosted pine trees lining the perimeter. Although Arthur Pendleton had died in his Colorado prison cell weeks earlier, the seismic wake left by his exposure continued to rumble through law enforcement agencies nationwide. The unearthing of the Anniston repository had rewritten the history of modern forensics, proving that microscopic, decades-old evidence could dismantle even the most complex web of historical crimes. At the Elena Vance Memorial Forensic Center, the work had not ceased with Pendleton's death. On the contrary, the center had been transformed into an international training institute and operational hub. Federal agents, forensic geneticists, and senior detectives from across North America and Europe now gathered in its lecture halls to study the methodologies forged during the Vance investigation. Yet, Inside the second-floor office of Detective Marcus Thorne and Detective Sarah Miller, a new kind of quiet had settled. The physical evidence wall, once covered in red pins, string, and black-and-white crime scene photos, was now almost completely bare. Only a single, clear plastic archive sleeve remained pinned to the center corkboard. Inside that sleeve rested a faded, yellowed carbon copy police log from August 12, 1987, the original record of the anonymous midnight phone call placed from the payphone on Ponce de Leon Avenue. Miller poured 2 cups of black coffee, placing one on Thorne's desk. She sat down across from him, looking at the faded document. "We closed 27 homicides, Marcus. We recovered remains across 8 states. We gave 27 families their lives back. But that payphone call still doesn't make sense." Thorne picked up his coffee, his eyes fixed on the 60-word transcript recorded by the Fulton County Dispatcher 40 years prior. Check the cellar on Oakwood Street. When Pendleton confessed to Elena's murder in 2025, Thorne said slowly, his voice reflecting months of quiet rumination, he claimed he made that call out of a sudden wave of panic and guilt 2 days after he buried her. He claimed he held his breath, dropped a dime into the slot, spoke those 6 words, and ran. "And we believed him, because it fit the narrative of a panicked killer," Miller replied, leaning forward. "But think about who Pendleton actually was, Marcus. We spent 18 months dissecting his mind, his journals, his audio tapes, and his hidden repository in Anniston. He was an absolute narcissist. He was a cold, calculating archivist who kept trophy cans, recorded audio journals of his abductions, and built a secret underground vault to store evidence for 30 years. A man like that doesn't experience sudden, overwhelming moral guilt. He doesn't risk exposure by calling the police on himself." Thorne set his cup down, the realization settling in the air like a cold draft. If Pendleton didn't make that phone call from Ponce de Leon Avenue, then who did? The question opened a subtle, terrifying fracture in a narrative everyone believed had been permanently sealed. If a second individual knew about the body in the Oakwood Street basement on August 12, 1987, it meant that for nearly 40 years, an unidentified witness, or an accomplice, had remained completely invisible to law enforcement. The task force was immediately reactivated in absolute secrecy. Thorne and Miller did not announce their fresh inquiry to the press or the department. They quietly pulled the original, physical 1,987 telecommunications dispatch logs from the basement archives of the Atlanta Police Department. In 1987, digital call tracing was in its infancy, but emergency dispatch centers utilized analog magnetic tape reels to record incoming emergency calls for quality and operational logging. The original master reel for August 12, 1987, Reel 87-0812, had sat sealed inside an anti-static foil envelope in the state telecommunications vault for nearly 4 decades. Thorne delivered the master reel to the center's Advanced Audio Forensics and Digital Restoration Laboratory. Using modern laser splicing technology and digital spectral isolation, audio engineers digitized the 40-year-old analog magnetic tape, stripping away the static, background hum, and electrical interference inherent to late 1980s landline telecommunications. The restored audio track was played through high-fidelity studio monitors in the clean room. The voice was clear, crisp, and undeniably distinct. Check the cellar on Oakwood Street. The engineers ran the audio through advanced vocal tract resonance profiling, a modern forensic process that measures the physical dimensions of a speaker's vocal cords, throat structure, and nasal passages based on frequency harmonics. Within 2 hours, the acoustic analysis software generated a definitive biological profile of the caller. Speaker profile: female. Estimated age at time of call: 20 to 25 years. No audible signs of hyperventilation or acute respiratory distress. Miller stared at the monitor in absolute disbelief. "It was a woman," she whispered. "A young woman made the call. It wasn't Pendleton." Thorne sat at the audio console, looping the 5-second recording continuously. As he listened to the background noise behind the female caller's voice, he noticed something subtle that had been masked by analog static for 40 years, a faint, rhythmic, metallic clicking sound recurring every 0.8 seconds, followed by the soft, distant chime of an electronic bell. Isolate the ambient background frequencies, Thorne instructed the lead audio engineer. Filter out the voice and the line hum. Boost the secondary acoustic layer. The engineer isolated the low-decibel background audio. The rhythmic clicking sound amplified, filling the room. Click-clack. Click-clack.
Ding.
That's not street noise from Ponce de Leon Avenue, Miller observed, her eyes wide. Ponce de Leon was a 4-lane asphalt arterial road with heavy vehicular traffic. That sound is mechanical, enclosed, and rhythmic. The audio engineering team cross-referenced the acoustic signature against an archival database of late 20th century commercial, industrial, and transportation sounds. Within 4 hours, the system identified the exact match, the mechanical tracking mechanism and terminal bell of an automated pharmacy pill sorting machine, specifically the Model 4 automat used exclusively in large regional hospital dispensaries during the mid-1980s. The payphone used to make the call on August 12, 1987, was not located on the corner of Ponce de Leon Avenue. It was located in the ground floor staff corridor directly outside the internal pharmacy at Grady Memorial Hospital, the exact hospital where Elena Vance had worked her late-night nursing shift on the night she vanished. The investigative frame shifted instantly and dramatically. The caller was not a random street bystander or an accomplice on the run. The caller was someone inside Grady Memorial Hospital who had seen or discovered something on the night of August 11, 1987, and had placed the emergency call from an internal hospital payphone before the killer ever left the premises. Thorne and Miller immediately audited the historical employment rosters of Grady Memorial Hospital from August 1987, specifically focusing on night shift nursing staff, pharmacy technicians, and floor supervisors who had worked alongside Elena Vance on the night of her abduction. Out of 42 personnel on duty that night, 38 had been interviewed during the original 1987 investigation. But one name stood out, a 23-year-old pediatric nurse named Juliana Mercer, who had been Elena's closest friend during their clinical rotations. According to the 1987 personnel files, Juliana Mercer had submitted a sudden, unexpected resignation from Grady Memorial Hospital on August 15, 1987, 3 days after Elena's body was recovered from the Oakwood Street basement. She had packed her belongings, moved out of her Atlanta apartment, and vanished from public records, never renewing her Georgia nursing license. For 40 years, local investigators had assumed Juliana Mercer had simply fled the city out of shock and grief over her friend's brutal murder. But equipped with modern digital database tracing and social security cross-referencing, Miller located Juliana Mercer within 3 hours. She was 63 years old, living under her married name, Juliana Vance Hayes, in a quiet coastal town near Beaufort, South Carolina. The following morning, Thorne and Miller drove through the sea mist of the South Carolina Lowcountry, pulling up to a modest wooden cottage overlooking a salt marsh. When Juliana opened the front door, she didn't look surprised. She looked at the gold badges hanging from Thorne and Miller's belts, then looked down at her own trembling hands. She invited them inside, pouring tea with slow, deliberate movements that betrayed decades of heavy, silent burden. On her living room mantelpiece rested a single-framed photograph, a young Juliana standing arm in arm with Elena Vance outside Grady Memorial Hospital in the summer of 1986. "I wondered when you would come," Juliana said softly,